Good morning. Welcome to everybody. I'm Fred Kemp. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. And it's my huge pleasure to welcome you this morning to Tipping Points, Finding Energy and Climate Balance. This important gathering serves as the capstone of this year's programming for the Atlantic Council's Millennium Leadership Program, our initiative dedicated to fostering the next generation of global leaders. If you're a user of social media, and who isn't, join us in the digital dialogue using the hashtag AC Tipping Points, hashtag AC Tipping Points. I want to start by thanking our partners in Germany, the Ecologic Institute, led by Andreas Kremer, who I'll be welcoming to the stage in just a moment. Wir bedanken uns. And since its founding in 2011, the Ecologic Institute and the Atlantic Council have worked hand in hand to develop one of the leading transatlantic networks of future leaders in the energy and climate sectors, known as the Emerging Leaders in Energy and Environment Policy Network, or as we call it here at the Atlantic Council, ELEAP. This type of constructive transatlantic civil society partnership is essential and has always been essential, but we feel it's more essential than ever today to ensure that our global community remains bound by our common cause and understanding and maintains robust platforms for collaboration. I'd like to recognize all our fellows in the audience, both Millennium Fellows as well as ELEAP Fellows, and since it's early in the morning, need to get the juices going, please all stand so we can give you a round of applause. I must say, when each class comes through, as I get to meet many of you individually at different events this week, but also later on as you reconvene elsewhere and in different locations, it's very often the high point of my year personally, and it certainly is the high point for many of our board members and many of our supporters who see the work on the future generation as so crucial because we really are in a period of history where we're going to be navigating disruption. And I'm not going to give a speech on that because I think you know that that's true. We've started a Center for Resilience because we don't think the question is whether things are going to be stable or whether things are going to be volatile. They're going to be volatile. Whether things are going to be certain or whether they're going to be uncertain, they're going to be uncertain. So what you really need is a next generation of leaders that can take this on with integrity, with intelligence, and with resilience. You hail from over 30 countries. You represent the full spectrum of opinions on issues ranging from politics to energy choices. Among you are rising executives at top global companies, entrepreneurs and inventors, elected officials and senior advisors to heads of state, renowned artists and civil society actors, thought leaders and academics, and more. You're truly an exceptional group representing the current and future leaders of the millennial generation. It's your innovation, an unwavering commitment to work together, despite your differences, to solve the most intractable challenges of our time that gives us all confidence in a brighter future, a future that you're going to build and maintain. Our investment in you is perhaps the most important investment we can make. And please make this interactive. Let us know what's working for you, what you want more of as you go along. And very often, the relationships you're building with each other are going to be the most important, lasting contribution to your lives. It is an honor and privilege to host you here today in that spirit. I'd also be remiss if I didn't pass along sincere appreciation to our supporters without whom this program would not be possible. First and foremost, I want to salute Bob Abernathy, Vice Chair of the Board of the Atlantic Council, who's been a hero of the Millennium Leadership Program all along. So, Bob, thank you so much. In particular, for this set of activities, the European Commission, a committed supporter of ELIP since the program's founding. Our conference sponsors from the private sector, Xylem, Meridium, and the Royal Bank of Canada. So please join me in a round of applause for them, without which we couldn't do this. These companies represent the kind of forward-thinking and socially responsible private sector engagement that's so critical to addressing global challenges such as climate change. And we need a lot more of them at the Atlantic Council as well. And so if you have any ideas of people who we can bring into this network, please let us know. The label Tipping Points recognizes the knife edge we find ourselves resting upon today. With every passing year, the margin for error and the window for corrective action to avert the worst consequences of climate change shrinks. We're already witnessing the dramatic consequences of a changing climate. It's had its impact on the conflict in Syria, which has its roots in a historic 3-year drought, to the increasing frequency of 100-year weather events, the rising average of temperatures, to concerns that an iceberg the size of Delaware, or if you're not from the United States, Kosovo, Cyprus, they're all about the same size, may be on the brink of detaching from the Antarctic. That's a pretty big iceberg. Leaving this issue for future generations to solve is simply no longer an option. Similarly, we're on the precipice of an energy revolution that holds the potential to transform our energy system and the possibility for a dramatically cleaner, low-carbon investment. We've had a lot of debate in the Atlantic Council about the impact of what I consider, at least, the unfortunate withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement. On the other hand, what impact will it really have? And that's part of the debate we can have here when energy transformation, technology transformation is racing so quickly ahead. Investment in clean energy continues to reach new highs year after year, and the cost of transitioning to new technologies continues to decline to historic lows. Many of the technical solutions required to mitigate climate change are already available to those societies able to mobilize the political will and capital to deploy them. In parallel to these environmental and technological shifts is the generational transition in leadership to you. As the largest age cohort in America and in many other countries of the world, your power and agency to advance the solutions we need and to do so rapidly on the international scale is enormous. We're doing a lot of work looking at this generation, for example, in the Middle East, a place of 4 civil wars, because the hope rests in the younger generation across the Arab world. The greatest task that lies ahead of you is to reach a common understanding on how to accomplish much before it's too late. The greatest obstacle to achieving this goal is division, much of it political in our communities, and in this respect, this conference represents a noteworthy accomplishment. Against a backdrop of hyper-partisanship, we're proud to host a platform for discussion that rises above the fray to address in a nonpartisan way the fundamental challenge of balancing the dual and sometimes competing imperatives of sustainable development and economic prosperity. At our awards dinner a week ago, we had in the same room Vice President Pence and Madeleine Albright. That doesn't happen a lot in Washington these days. Vice President Pence recommitted the United States to Article 5 collective defense of our allies, a view that was reinforced a few days later by President Trump. Madeleine Albright reinforced that same view on the 70th anniversary of the Marshall Plan. That's the world we try to bring together, where we see crucial issues for the future of the world order, and we see divisions that may endanger that, and where we can, we jump in and we try to do our best. There is a real difficult challenge of balancing the dual and sometimes competing imperatives of sustainable development and economic prosperity in your fields. At the Atlantic Council, you're geographically located at the political ground zero of this competition. If you were standing in this room a few months ago and were able to look out this window where there's a pretty active construction site, much quieter construction site than it was a few months ago, you would have seen a giant banner bearing the word resist suspended from the cranes across there, and the whole road was shut down for most of a day because of that. And it was a message of resistance placed there by Greenpeace activists. 2 blocks in the other direction, you find the White House, the seat of power of our federal government, where the decision was made to withdraw from Paris. In the current political environment, the temptation to entrench in partisan positions and not speak to each other is powerful. In this conference, as in all of our work at the Council, we do our best to remain nonpartisan, objective, and above all, dedicated to respectful, solutions-oriented discourse, but also unflinchingly to the values of the transatlantic community of democracy, transparency, rule of law, and individual rights, and many more. That's why our agenda today includes representatives from both the institutions I just mentioned, Greenpeace and the U.S. federal government. It also includes leading voices from around the world from the fields of renewables and oil and gas, finance and civil society, and speakers from diverse walks of life, ranging from filmmakers to soldiers. This gathering is unique not only in its balance, but also in its multidisciplinary approach. The challenge we face is too complex and too far-reaching to be solved effectively by any one actor or any one group. It will not be solved by the energy sector alone, nor will it be solved by conservationists alone, or by the financial sector, or the government, or politicians. It can only be solved by all of these stakeholders and many others I didn't mention working in collaboration and common cause. As such, we're proud to have an audience and a lineup of speakers that represents the full spectrum of perspectives. It is a very impressive agenda. This multidisciplinary approach is central to what the Council has been throughout its now almost 60-year history. Our founding mission and operational philosophy recognizes global challenges require global solutions, and that these in turn require the combined input and cooperation of actors across our societies and around the world. So that's why we're here today, to convene a community of influencers that will work together in a type of bipartisan, I would almost say multi-partisan, cross-disciplinary fashion I just described. Today, it is more essential than ever, and today it is more urgent than ever to take on the greatest challenge for the millennial generation, and that is an energy and climate balance. Now, having endowed you all as the Atlantic Council with that weighty task, I'm going to turn it over to Andreas, founder, director emeritus of the Ecologic Institute, and a good friend. He's been one of the strongest champions for transatlantic cooperation on energy security, climate action, and environmental protection, particularly through his work at the Ecologic Institute, but also beyond. We've been privileged to work with Andreas and the Ecologic team for several years on these issues, and we look forward to working with you in the future. Please join me in welcoming Andreas.
Thank you, Fred. That was very generous and kind, and not fully deserved, I must say. This is a tipping point conference, and you've explained it all so well. There's very little for me to add, except that, in my mind, it is not a balance between energy and climate. The tipping points, there are several of them, and there is a race between tipping points. We're heading for tipping points we know exist, but we don't know exactly where they are. On the climate system, we know that the faster we increase our emissions, the faster global climate change goes, acidification of the ocean goes, the sooner we will reach those tipping points, and then detrimental change will accelerate. But at the same time, and you pointed that out, we also have the promises of technology, the promises of a new generation of people understanding things in a more fundamental way than we did in the past to change behaviors. And there are tipping points also, technological tipping points in the energy systems, in the transport system, food production system, and other things, but there are also societal tipping points that we are only beginning to address in the sense that we also want to understand how we can accelerate reaching them. Because the more we can accelerate the changes in the energy system, in the transport system, in our building system, in our consumption and production systems, the sooner we can do that, the safer we are with our environment in the future. And the more we can delay the reaching of the climate tipping points, the more time we have to do the other things. So it's a race of tipping points. And you, from the Millennium Leadership Program and the ELEAP program, you're the people who help us accelerate the transformations towards the tipping points we want to reach, and at the same time the delay of the other tipping points that we hopefully can avoid. The focus here is on decarbonization, and that is a proper focus, but we should not forget that there is also massive biodiversity loss that needs to be addressed in its own right, and saving the climate, but at the same time diminishing biodiversity is not going to help humanity survive. At the moment, everybody talks quite rightly about the plastics in the ocean. It's a modern civilization problem that can be solved relatively easily if we have the political will. It needs no capital. There is also the point of acidification, which threatens the protein supply from the oceans, without which, as humanity, we could not have the animal protein that we need. We could not produce the equivalent amount on land, given the stresses that we have on the land, because we also have soil loss all around the world. We should never forget that there's a multitude of challenges when we focus on decarbonization. And as a German, I would also add to this that in the energy transformation, we must also pay attention that we get out of nuclear power as well. It is not economically viable, never has been. It can only be explained by economic delusion, corruption, or military intent and purpose. And yet our societies still invest a lot of money, talent and time in this dead-end technology that we need elsewhere in order to reach those tipping points in the energy system, in the transport transformation and elsewhere. At this point, I wanted to welcome Jigga Sharp, our keynote speaker, but he hasn't arrived yet. Perhaps he's getting up in the building at the moment, and then we can greet him. Let me say something about the ELEAP network. The ELEAP network, and you've seen the people here as they rose from their seats early on, they are what I would call a virtual think tank. There are many things. A think tank, they feel like a family when they meet. The community is the right word, but it's a community that has family values. But amongst themselves, they do surprising things. They question one another. They contest one another's assumptions, data, arguments, the ideas that they develop towards solutions. It all happens in cyberspace. Somebody asks a question in the Facebook group, and immediately there are responses from other people. And more often than not, this ends up in a really fruitful discussion that helps one of the members or several of the ELEAP network. It ends in a policy paper that is written up and that goes somewhere where people hopefully base decisions on the ideas, or it ends up in a scientific journal article. All of this has happened in the past. It happens more often than you think. They do what is essentially a think tank function, contesting ideas, questioning one another's assumptions, values, the narratives, the framings, how we understand problems. All of this they do as a community, helping one another grow. The net effect of that is that each one of those young people, and I call them young because I'm older, my daughters would call you old, okay? But all of them have a benefit in demonstrable career acceleration. We've all placed bets on you. The bet is based on the basis of achievement, because you've all achieved something already, but it's also placed on the promise that you all hold for achieving even more. And so far, and that is what motivates me to do this work, so far you've always repaid that, or made good on that bet. I haven't lost a single bet on an ELEAP fellow. And for that, I want to thank you, all of you. It is your achievement and it's your promise that motivates us to go forward. And I say this at this point where we are 7 weeks away from the current ending of funding. There is no more money. This is the second time the network, the ELEAP network, I don't know about the Millennium Leadership Program, reaches a hiatus where the community has to show that it can survive even when there is no food on the table. Last time we did it, and then eventually new funding came in. I hope and I trust we can do it again. But it takes some nerve to do that. But I do want to thank you also for your engagement, for your enthusiasm, and for the good work that you do and coordinate through the virtual community that we've built. Tipping points are high points. They're like summits, and there's a good tradition when you go to a summit, you have a Sherpa. In this case, we have 3 Sherpas that guide us to the next tipping points on society, climate, and energy, and here they are. Sam Hampton from Oxford Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford, Sarah Abdulrahim, policy analyst from the US Department of the Interior, and Sally Kalinda, Director of External Affairs of BP America. So we've put together somebody from science, somebody from public administration, and somebody from business in order to guide us to the tipping points. Here you are, and thank you.
Thank you, Andreas. So just a couple of announcements, housekeeping announcements for everybody. This event is on the record unless otherwise noted. A live stream is also available online. And again, we encourage you to engage on Twitter with hashtag #ACTippingPoints. You might have also noticed that there's some activity going on outside. We have an artist here today, Omaidi Sharifi. He's an internationally recognized, award-winning muralist from Kabul, Afghanistan. He'll be painting his signature eye design today throughout the day, and all participants are encouraged to contribute to this painting during either one of the breaks or the lunchtime session. Please go contribute to the painting. We have materials available. We also have gloves so that you don't get too dirty. So please go visit that station before the end of the day. So good morning again, everybody. My name is Sarah Abdulrahim. I am a current ELEAP fellow. And I'm very honored and excited to join all of you over the next couple of days to discuss one of the most important issues of our generation. So we'll see some of the most severe climate impacts during our lifetime. The Earth's average temperature has risen more than 1 degree Celsius since the year 1880. And this doesn't seem like very much, but global temperature is accelerating, and we're already seeing a range of impacts around the world. So, for example, over the past 60 years, we've noticed an increase in many different extreme events, including flooding, droughts, and wildfires. And over the past 100 years, global sea level has been rising. And as a result, many coastal communities around the world, from Kiribati in the Pacific to Louisiana in the United States, are literally at risk of washing away. So as the previous speakers have noted, the name of this conference is Tipping Points. And in the context of climate change, we typically define a tipping point as a threshold for an abrupt and irreversible change. As the magnitude of global temperature increase, the risk of exceeding many of these tipping points also increases. Scientists have identified a number of potential tipping points, many of which are well documented. So, for example, many scientists say that glaciers along parts of the coast of Greenland passed a tipping point in 1997, and since then, glaciers have been melting 3 times as quickly in that region. So future global temperature increase and its impacts will depend largely on the short and the long-term actions that the global community takes. As many of you know, the global community has set a collective goal to limit global temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius. But many are beginning to argue that we actually need to adopt a target that's even lower to avoid some of the worst impacts. So it's clear that we need to reduce our global greenhouse gas emissions in order to avoid certain tipping points. But we need to do this in a balanced way where we are still meeting our energy needs. And we also need to keep in mind that even as we take action to mitigate climate change today, we'll have to continue adapting to the urgent climate change impacts we are experiencing already on a daily basis around the world. So meeting all of these challenges will require cooperative, proactive, and thoughtful approaches. And my guess is that you will hear a few themes today as it relates to those approaches, and I'd just like to mention a few of those from my own personal perspective. So the first theme is the role that science plays and should play in our conversations. In recent years, we've learned a great deal about the changes that are currently taking place and the changes that are projected to take place. We know that climate change is happening and is posing risks to our societies and our ecosystems. But it's important to advance this understanding so that we have a more robust scientific basis for decision making. We also need to support research and innovation when it comes to emerging technologies that can help us meet the mitigation and adaptation challenges. And at the same time, it's important to consider our energy needs around the world, and finding appropriate balances will require a science-based understanding. But identifying the appropriate solutions will require a range of different stakeholders to come together. So you'll probably hear more about these issues if you plan to attend the climate-focused breakout session this afternoon. We'll be hearing from Scott Radar of the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research and Jane Burston from the UK National Physical Laboratory. So despite scientific advances, there's still a lot of uncertainty about the exact nature of the projected scope and magnitude of climate change impacts. But this, however, should not be an excuse for inaction. Despite the uncertainties that do exist, we still know a great deal, and we need to continue searching for holistic solutions that offer benefits regardless of what ends up happening in the future. So where possible, we need to identify solutions where the benefits outweigh the costs, even in the absence of climate change. So to identify these types of solutions, again, we need a variety of people at the table. And so you've already heard that a number of times this morning already, and I'm sure you'll continue hearing that throughout the day. Climate change is a complex issue, and identifying a response really requires a range of different types of people across disciplines to be part of the conversation, including the people here in this room. So the voices and perspectives of policymakers, innovators, businesses, engaged citizens, they will all be critical. When it comes to adaptation, it's especially important to include those that are on the front lines of climate change in the conversation in order to develop solutions that are locally and regionally appropriate. And furthermore, it's important whenever possible to include marginalized people who are particularly vulnerable to climate change. It's not enough that all of these parties come together only when a decision needs to be taken. It's crucial that they find spaces to have these conversations early and often. And finally, we have to remember that climate change transcends borders. We can argue that an individual country may only have a very small contribution to climate change, but together as a global community, we have a very large impact. We live in an increasingly interconnected world where one's actions can greatly impact others. So even when it comes to efforts to adapt to climate change, which usually occurs at a very local level, there's still an opportunity to work across national boundaries to share lessons and best practices. And that's why groups like ELEAP and the Millennium Fellowship Program and other groups that you represent today are so important for bringing young people from different corners of the world to share their perspectives and challenges and ideas for solutions, and inspiring collaboration to achieve common goals. So today we'll be hearing from many leading figures. For example, we'll be hearing from Christine Todd Whitman. She's the former governor of New Jersey and the former administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And I hope you will find discussions today both interesting and inspiring, and we encourage you to get to know each other, ask questions, and share your own experiences. So CO2 emissions will likely peak within the next 15 years, and within that time frame, many of the people here today will be among the top government leaders, business leaders, and thought leaders. So the voice of the younger generation here today is important not just to the challenges that we face today, but the challenges that we will face tomorrow, especially as you all move into those leadership positions. So for the foreseeable future, we will need to consider how to avoid the worst impacts of climate change and adapt to unavoidable changes while transforming our energy systems. So I thank each and every one of you for being here today, and I look forward to the conversations over the next couple of days and discussing how we can move forward. So thank you.
They do.
And I can see that.
Good morning, everyone. Let's see if I can adjust the mic here.
All right. My name is Sally Kalinda. I am the Director of External Affairs at BP, and I am thrilled to be part of today's conference. Kudos to the Atlantic Council for putting such a great agenda together and for really it's a welcome conversation for a balanced discussion on energy and climate. And I think it's perfect that remarks about energy would follow a presentation on climate, because you cannot have a conversation about one without including the other. I think I'm going to sort of set this out by looking back a little bit to help us look forward and see what's on the horizon. And I'm going to start by mentioning the Statistical Review of World Energy. How many of you are familiar with the Statistical Review? A few of you. Okay, great. So each year, BP puts out a statistical review, and it is a document that talks to you about how the world consumed energy over the last year. And we make all of this available to the public on our website, free of charge. Go download your spreadsheets and graphs at bp.com, shameless plug, and use it to make your own predictions. So I am not an economist. We're not going to get very deep into this, but I think there are 2 or 3 points that will help frame our conversation today that are worth noting. First is that we are seeing weak growth for the past 3 years in global energy demand. And the growth that we are seeing is in developing countries. It's not in our traditional OECD markets. Also, for the 3rd year in a row, carbon emissions have been relatively flat. And that raises a lot of eyebrows and asks many questions about whether or not this is a long-term trend. We know this is partially due to energy efficiency. We also know that this is partially due to the Chinese economy, but time will tell if this is a sustainable point. The third is that the fuel mix continues to change. We are seeing renewables bring up even more of the fuel mix. We are seeing coal consumption and production fell dramatically last year. So these points lead us to our challenge, and it's a dual challenge. We know that around the world, there are still more than 1 billion people who do not have access to energy. And we also know that having access to that energy gives you economic opportunity, it creates new opportunities more broadly, and it helps lift people out of poverty. So we have to find a way to meet this global energy demand while still reducing carbon emissions. So I want you to know the way we think about this. For the past 20 years at BP, our position on climate has not changed. We believe it is a real threat, that it is a long-term challenge, and that it requires global action. And we're doing something about that. We recognize that as a global company, we can solve problems in a way that few other companies can. We can see that the industry is changing rapidly, faster than it has probably in any of our lifetimes, with disruption, with geopolitical challenges, and the changing fuel mix. And we want to be part of that transition. We want to lead it. We also recognize that whether it's in our own outlook for the next 20 years in energy or any independent outlook with IEA, IHS Markit, with MIT, that oil is going to continue to be part of the mix for the next 20 years. So we recognize that we have to find a way to produce oil more efficiently. So we're modernizing our operations across the country and across the company to make sure that we can do that better. We're also then evaluating our own fossil fuel investments, and we're making a pivot to gas. So 6 of the 7 projects we're going to bring on around the world this year are natural gas projects. And for those of you raising eyebrows, we also recognize that leads to an issue of methane emissions, and we want to lead in that area as well. And I will share a bit about that. We are also expanding the use of renewables. I'm very proud to say that BP has the largest renewables business of any major oil and gas company in the world. And we've got a big wind business in the US, we've got a biofuels business in Brazil. We're learning that supply chain, and we want to take what we've learned there and apply it to our portfolio so we can grow it and make it better. At the same time, we're using our venturing arm to invest in lower carbon technologies and finding a way to make them commercially viable. We also want to be part of the solution in the external conversation. So we are members of the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative. This is a consortium of 10 companies, some integrated oil companies like BP and Shell, and others that are national oil companies like Saudi Aramco. And we represent together 20% of oil and gas production, and it's a voluntary group that is working together to find climate solutions. And as part of that work, we've funded collectively and the oil and gas OGCI, Oil and Gas Climate Initiative Investments Group, and we've made a collective pledge to spend $1 billion on low carbon investments over the next 10 years. So the focus of these investments right now is on reducing methane emissions, on developing carbon capture, use, and storage technologies, and also on finding opportunities to improve efficiency in the transportation and infrastructure sectors. Yesterday, we had one more announcement that I think is particularly interesting for this group and a point for which I'm very proud, which we announced our role as a founding member of the Climate Leadership Council. And you may have heard about this group. It is a plan that was authored by James Baker and George Shultz, and it is a large coalition of companies. There's quite the range. You've got BP, Shell, Total, ExxonMobil, but you've also got PepsiCo, you've got Johnson & Johnson, P&G, and we're working alongside NGOs like Conservation International and the Nature Conservancy, and a group of leaders like Michael Bloomberg, Stephen Hawking, a range of experts from Harvard and other academic institutions. And the idea is that together we can come up with a market-based climate solution that is both pro-growth, pro-environment, and bipartisan. And we want to see this move. And our hope is that the council will really help foster a dialogue that will encourage governments to embrace this idea. BP has long advocated for carbon pricing to limit carbon emissions. So, at the risk of sounding like a BP commercial, and at this point I may already sound like a BP commercial, but let me tell you that I am incredibly proud to work for my company. We provide heat, light, and mobility solutions for the world. And we also recognize that the way we provide those solutions is going to change over the next 20 years. And rather than running from that change, we're embracing it. We want to build our business on what the market demands and not in this constant quest for supply. So what does this matter to us as millennials? Well, I think now we have a number of challenges on the energy landscape, but the biggest challenge we have is about how we harness our energy as a collective. And this is actually why I submitted my application for the ELEAP Fellowship. All too often, and particularly in Washington, we see biases start to influence our work. Issues are politicized to the point of gridlock, and collaboration is often viewed as a four-letter word. And we're definitely guilty of this in the climate debate. And we've got to stop. If you hear nothing else in my presentation today, I hope this is what you walk away with. We've got to stop vilifying each other. We are in this together. Energy issues and environmental issues are not a battle of good versus evil. We have got to lose the zero-sum mentality that holds us back and say, I need to win and you need to lose. In the climate debate, if one side loses, everybody loses. We've got to show the world that our generation can help make public and private sectors work together in harmony alongside the intellectual community to come up with meaningful solutions that are sustainable and that will help us into the future. And I believe that we can start that work today. So we're going to hear from a range of experts, as you've already gotten a little preview, including former Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel, who is going to talk to us about national security and climate change. And my challenge to you, my challenge to myself and to all of us, is that we would open our hearts today, we would listen, and when you feel that tendency where you want to argue your point with the speaker while they're talking, to resist and try to hear their perspective. If we can start to see each other as humans and we start to remember we're in it together and it's going to take all of us to find solutions, that's the way we're going to progress the conversation. So I hope you will remember your observations throughout the day, remember any feedback you have, and when we do our wrap-up session, I look forward to starting a dialogue that I hope continues for years to come. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Sam Hampton. I'm a LEAP member from the class of 2015, and I'm studying for a PhD at the University of Oxford in energy demand policy. So I've been given the topic of society, which is of course extremely broad, and actually rather than try and define it or close it down too much, I actually want to keep the kinds of conversations that we're having, the kinds of debates, as broad as possible, even philosophical. So although Sally's just talked to us about energy and the huge challenge of decarbonising our energy system, that's, it leads us down a kind of technical or economic path of creating that kind of discourse. I think we also really need to be thinking about society and the kinds of relationships that society has with the environment and the kinds of narratives and conversations that we're creating around climate change. So I've got 3 points to make, and the first is in keeping with this broad perspective, a little bit controversial. So I think it's a mistake to see climate change primarily as a scientific phenomenon, something that's, about greenhouse gas emissions and tons of carbon. I mean, obviously, we spend many of our working lives on that, but actually, I think these conversations are primarily technical, and they lead to technical solutions. And I think even to think of climate change, thinking of the word solutions in relation to climate change can be a mistake, because actually I think climate change emerges out of the way that we have constructed our societies, how we distribute power, how it's held by some groups and not by others, how we govern our economic system, we rely on consumption and perpetual growth, and actually kind of philosophically how we have created an ontological separation between the concepts of nature and the environment and society and man. So if we're going to have these kinds of conversations, these philosophical disciplines, we need definite opportunity. I think even more so than the kind of average conference I go to as an academic, we have a real range of views and disciplines here, and of course representation from countries all either side of the Atlantic. The second point is another slightly challenging point, which is to challenge everyone here to think a bit introspectively. So we're very flatteringly told that we might be the next generation of future leaders, which is fantastic. And when I think about leadership, I think a really important quality of a leader is integrity, personal integrity, leading by example. And in the energy and climate space, that of course means we need to think about our own impact on the environment. It's a really difficult conversation to have, even with yourself. And I think part of it is to say that we don't necessarily have that much control over our environmental impact. Our footprints are interwoven with our everyday lives and, of course, our professional roles, and we have limited control. So, for example, in the UK, 80% of houses are connected to the natural gas grid, and my house in Oxford is one of those. So by far the easiest and cheapest way for me to heat my home through the 9-month British winter is to burn a fossil fuel in my house. And as an aspiring academic with career ambitions, of course, it's very difficult to turn down a fantastic opportunity to present at an international conference like this, and that involves flying, of course. And I think reducing your carbon footprint can be quite unrewarding, and carbon emissions are largely invisible, and the lower carbon route can often be more expensive and involve more hassle. So I happen to know, because earlier this year I announced to my family that I was going to spend a month as a vegetarian, just for climate reasons, and the look my mother-in-law gave me was enough to put most people off. And then another example is that my wife and I wanted to go skiing in the Swiss Alps this year, and so I said, well, why don't we try not to fly? Let's get the train. Yes, it takes longer and it's more expensive, but it's the right thing to do. We'll stop in Paris and make a holiday of it. So we booked it, but what we didn't know was that when we'd be traveling, my wife would be very newly pregnant and suffering with awful morning sickness. So on top of that, I put her through 9 hours of motion sickness too. So yeah, I think for sure it can often be the easier option to go with accepted societal behaviours, even when they're high impact. And actually, I think it's true to say that the path towards leadership involves a high carbon lifestyle. But nonetheless, a challenge to us all to really think about the narratives and conversations we're having with ourselves around our personal integrity. Okay, the third point I want to make is around framing the climate discourse. So I indicated I think it's a mistake to focus, for example, on how do we get more people to accept the science of climate change, or say I work in energy demand. How do we get people to use less energy or to care more for the environment? These conversations, we have these all the time, and I think they're important, but they are quite narrow, and I think they imply an us and them approach, the idea of kind of elites cajoling and persuading the masses to change their attitudes and behaviours. So I think it's incumbent upon us to think about creating the kinds of conversations and discourses which all sectors of society can engage in, so particularly the right and the working classes. Because unfortunately, climate change is highly political. In fact, last year Yale did a poll that showed that in the US it's actually the most politically divisive issue. So more than gun control, abortion and immigration, pollsters can ask people what their views on climate change are, what they think the government should be doing about it, and that will indicate to the pollster whether they're more likely to vote on the left or the right. So on that, Leah Dean from Greenpeace is joining us for our breakout session after lunch. And obviously Greenpeace are possibly one of the most well-known organisations and brands associated with the environmental movement, and they're unashamedly on the left. But what I want to do is I want to challenge her a bit and say, look, actually the dominance of organisations on the left, is that there's an argument to be said that has served to marginalise climate change and environmental issues, and actually, make us all in the environmental movement be seen as a kind of hair-shirted hippies, and we need actually to make this less politically divisive. So in the UK, we recently celebrated the first day since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution where we didn't burn any coal to generate electricity. And so, my Twitter feed was full of celebrations and congratulations and press releases around that. But we don't really think enough about how those tweets are perceived by, say, Welsh ex-coal miners who are struggling to find work. And I think that's really important. And I've done a bit of work with an organisation called Climate Outreach in Oxford, who specialise in thinking about climate conversations and particularly engaging the centre-right. And they say, so they have some principles. One is that it's essential that when your figurehead conveying your climate messages is trusted and authentic. They say don't emphasize the expertise of scientists and talk about facts and figures, but actually appeal to people's values. So link, for example, conservatism with conservation. The evidence suggests that conservatives tend to be very supportive of renewables, particularly when they're community owned and they see an investment come back into the community, say for rooftop solar as well. And that appeals to their sense of community, but also the desire to be in control of their own energy security. So my final point really is just to say, I think in an ideal world, climate change and the environment would be less political. And I'm personally optimistic that is possible, that there could be some kind of centrist vision of climate narratives. And I'm cautiously, optimistically looking to the example of Emmanuel Macron in France. He obviously, as we know, recently became president, having created a new political party only a few months before, and he stole the centre ground and he put climate right and renewables right at the forefront of his campaign. So I'm looking with interest to France, and perhaps in our cohort of future leaders, there's someone that can pick up that mantle and do something similar in other countries. So thank you. Those are my thoughts on society, and I hope we'll have some wide-reaching and deep and possibly philosophical discussions about this throughout the day. But finally, it is my honour to be asked to introduce our opening keynote speaker. And this is someone that I've come across when I started my PhD. I was like trying to consume as much learning about energy as I possibly could, and so I listened to the podcast, The Energy Gang, which is fantastic. It's quite US centered, so a lot of the debates about net metering policy in states went over my head, but I still learned a huge amount from it. So this guy founded Sun Edison, the major global renewables firm, and wrote a book called Creating Climate Wealth, and now is the president of Generate Capital, and he is Jigga Sharp.
Thank you very much. As you may notice, I don't have shoes on. I'd like to say I had my high heels on and got caught in a grate, but that didn't happen. It was a shoe emergency nonetheless. So for those of you who would like to take off your shoes and join me, feel free. I really want to thank you for that warm welcome. This is my first time actually to the Atlantic Council. I've been in DC since 1996, having recently actually moved back to DC about 10 days ago. And it's kind of interesting to figure out how you get here, right? My wife was a senior executive at the State Department for years. My cousin, Sonal, was on the transition team for Obama and helped start the Center for American Progress. And so, but I'm the one up here, talking to all of you. And it's an interesting thing about how I got here. I, was born in India, grew up in rural Illinois, thought about working in the solar industry back in 1990 while I was in high school, and then got my mechanical engineering degree, and here I am. I started a company. It was successful. We sold it. We made money, and I wonder still why I get invited to these things, right? This is where Madeleine Albright and Mike Pence get together to talk about how to save us from whatever Trump said last week, or this is where these extraordinary people come to talk about things, and it got me thinking, and the only rational thing I can say is that we're lacking in a framework, right? The reason why I'm here is because I started a successful company, the business model of which has now attracted around $1 trillion of private capital since 2003. Today, Goldman Sachs, everyone else is sort of using the same technology. The Prime Minister of India is now saying, well, this is the framework by which we're going to raise $100 billion to roll this out. So that's why I'm here. And then I was on the board of Greenpeace for 6 years. And so I learned a little bit about how they do their muckraking. And then I was brought into this climate works effort, right? The Hewlett Foundation funded for, in the run up to Copenhagen. They're like, hey, you're a solar entrepreneur. You'd be an interesting voice. Why don't we bring you in? And why don't we talk about how we do shared sacrifice, right? If you remember the Copenhagen negotiations, it's just 1 cup of Starbucks a month to be able to save the planet. And when you think about that, it's around that time I sold the company, and Sir Richard Branson called me up and said, hey, I'm starting this new global nonprofit. Would you like to run it? It was a nonprofit called the Carbon War Room. And the first thing we did was say, what was wrong with Copenhagen, right? What was wrong with the carbon cap and trade bill in the United States? And what was wrong was it was not an American approach, right? Since World War II, we have been living an American rules-based framework, right? I'm not sure I knew that, to tell you the truth, but I kind of have come to that realization. I've been doing a lot of events with the Aspen Institute, and they've ingrained into me American exceptionalism and all sorts of interesting buzzwords that I'm not sure I knew the meaning of. And so now you come to what is this American framework, right? It's this framework around the use of innovation, industrialization, and yes, fossil fuel energy to create a much better way of life, right? Air conditioning that we're all enjoying today, right? The car, right, that gets ever more heavy because we feel safer in them, even though there's no data to support that. All of those things is what we think of as the American way. And I remember selling solar around the world. I was in Abu Dhabi, and I was in Qatar, and then I was in India and other places. And no one wanted, when they were, I don't know if you know this, how this works, but you go to these countries and they say, we want to build a new city here. And I'm like, really? That's how it goes? Okay. So we want to build a new city here. And when they said that, they said, no one ever said, I want to build a new city after Bonn or Berlin or London. It was always Houston, Los Angeles, DC, New York, right? All of these countries around the world were telling me how they wanted to replicate some US thing that they had imagined in their head. And it was at that time that it dawns on you that that is the impact of this American rules-based infrastructure and sort of economy that we talk about. And when the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, we thought about sort of well, do we need to update it, right? I mean, we sort of put it all in place to, to defeat the Russians, right? I mean, communism and all that stuff. And we said, well, we need to build suburbia and we need to outspend them and we need to do military. All these framework things the Atlantic Council had a crucial role in putting together is something that we put together for that common enemy. And we never replaced it. Bill Clinton didn't bother to replace it. George W. Bush clearly didn't replace it. And Obama, I think, didn't even want to talk about it, right? So Obama didn't talk about it at all. So now we're sitting here with me talking to you, right? Why? Because everyone's desperate for a framework. And the folks that in my industry have actually created a framework. We didn't mean to, by the way. Like, no one asked us to, and we didn't want to. We are very comfortable doing what we do in our niche where only a few people listen to the Energy Gang podcast and no one really cares that much about like what I have to say. But when you think about the Paris Agreement is a new global framework, right? When you think about what the Indian Prime Minister is doing today, he believes very strongly that fossil fuels is what is destroying the economy of India because they do not have local fuels, right? They're importing from Australia, Mozambique, South Africa. They're importing natural gas from Iran via a pipeline from Pakistan. That's not usually the best thing to do. And so you're in this situation where the Indian government is saying we're going to be at 100% electric vehicles by 2030. I have no idea whether they can hit that or not, right? So like let's not like make this a proclamation. But at the same time, that is a framework for one of the, or if not the most populous country in the world, right? And so he's not actually creating this framework around consumerism. He's not creating a framework around all of the other things that one would think that we're promoting since, that is the American framework. He's promoting a framework around the use of technology and innovation and entrepreneurship and finance and all of these other rules-based approaches that we all know and love for the purpose of deploying solar power farms, for the purpose of deploying wind energy, for the purpose of deploying electric vehicles, right? The Chinese, they're building electric buses as fast as they can. BYD is a company you've never heard of, except that Warren Buffett actually owns a piece of it, right? And so these are extraordinary times, and we are being asked to create a framework, right? And none of you guys were invited. None of you guys were invited to the Founding Fathers conference. That was a conference we went to. Like, it was a weird conference, I can tell you. But we were all invited to that conference, and we were not told that we're creating a new global framework, right? We were told, like, you need to defeat climate change. But what does that mean, right? Climate change is the burning of fossil fuels. It's the management of land use, right? Stopping the destruction of the Amazon or the extraordinary like sort of palm oil plantations in Indonesia or other things, right? That's climate change, right? And so when I was at the Carbon War Room, we said, well, let's split it up into 17 sectors. Each one represents roughly the same amount of carbon. Let's figure out a gigaton throwdown, which is basically like how we save a gigaton of carbon out of each one of those pie slices, right? Using like Sokolov's like sort of analogy. And then we, it was interesting. A lot of folks said, oh, you can save a gigaton of carbon in cement. That's cool. You can save a gigaton of carbon in, transportation. Amazing, right? Buildings, power, right? It's extraordinary. Did we set out to set up a new framework for the world order? No, we did not. And I love Sir Richard Branson, but I don't think he was thinking about that, right? I love out there it says like, there is no planet B, which I am sure the chairman of my board did not come up with, but he certainly popularized it in 2010 at the COP. He said there's no planet B, and suddenly it was retweeted around the world, and everyone loved it, and so Jose Maria Figueres, I think will own that phrase for a long time to come. And so all of you should take your paintbrushes out and put a little paint on that so we can get that done today and up at 14th and U, I think, right? And but so we put this together, right? And now you've got entire economies, right? Now you've got cities signing up to the Paris Accord. You got Pittsburgh, we're in the Paris Accord. Wait, I thought you were with Trump. No, we're with the Paris Accord. And then you've got, Los Angeles and the C40, and you've got like small towns that probably shouldn't be on the list, but they are. And then you've got, like institutes of higher learning who've said, we're going to do it. This is amazing, right? And what are they doing? What exactly do you think that they're doing, right? They don't know what they're doing. They just signed this thing, right? And so now they go to the next city council meeting and they say, well, what should we do? Oh, let's Google it. Oh, crap, Jigga Sharp's thing came up with the carbon war room. We should download those reports. We should read them. And we should actually hire those entrepreneurs to deploy whatever it is that he's promoting in that report. And that is literally how it goes. And it's sad, right? Because this organization and all of you need to be a part of this conversation, right? The fact that you're not part of this conversation and that we're talking about psychological barriers to, believing in climate change is ridiculous, right? This is the new world order, right? The entire world order is based on what you would consider, modernity, right? You want a car, you want a house, you want electricity, you want clean drinking water, you want a place that the stuff goes to when you flush the toilet, right? You want to make sure that you don't have to see it again, that the pipes work, right? That there's a wastewater treatment facility slightly outside of the city that you can't see because they've got big barriers around it that actually converts it back into drinking water. And then, oh wait, there's anaerobic digesters. What is that? Well, that's there too, and they're converting stuff to natural gas, right? All of these things that you guys probably don't actually know in great detail is what we're talking about. That is the Paris Agreement, right? That is what we're talking about, right? And so we need all of these folks to come in. Like I was really pleased when Rex Tillerson became Secretary of State, because I thought this is the first guy that has ever been in that position who actually knows how oil is found, brought out of the ground, brought through a pipeline. Why do we need a pipeline in Azerbaijan? He knows, right? And then it goes into this thing, Straits of Hormuz, it goes into a refinery, it creates like all these different distillate products. Oh, why do we burn like tar in ships? Because no one else can use it. Great. Okay, he knows that stuff, right? And then it goes to a gas station. And all of that is very sensitive, right? That's why we need peace. That's why we need prosperity. That's why we need what we're talking about in the world. Because if any of that gets disrupted, you don't get to drive. Right? I mean, that's the weird thing, right? Is that if any of it gets disrupted, you don't get to come here for this conference because you don't live here, right? And well, also, if it gets to 127 degrees out, you don't get to come here because this planes apparently can't fly in 127 degrees. We learned yesterday. So it's, it's one of those weird things where this world is very fragile, right? And unfortunately, we've become experts in that. Because I have to build stuff in lots of countries around the world. I have to figure out what OPIC stands for, and Exim Bank stands for, and the World Bank stands for, and how do I actually figure out how to do currency exchanges? I'm a mechanical engineer from Illinois. I don't know how this stuff works, right? But they forced me to, because they're like, I don't know, how do you build a 100 megawatt facility in Jordan? Wait, what? People do business in Jordan? Like, how do you do that? Like, oh, you need risk insurance, and you need to figure out this, and then you need oh wait, there's a special office in the World Bank that does Jordan, right? I had to figure that out. Oh, and there's a law firm here in the city who actually specializes in Jordan. Really? How does that happen? But they do, right? And they come to the Atlantic Council. They come to these meetings, right? And I didn't know. So thanks for telling me. Now I'm here. So what I would suggest to you is that I think your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to figure out what this looks like as a real framework, right? We need a real framework to succeed the World War II framework that was put into place, right? Clearly. I mean, one of the reasons why Trump is willing to go amok is because nobody's put forward an alternative framework, right? The alternative frameworks everyone put up is, why don't we do more of the same? Here's why NATO is so important. Here's why all these other institutions are so important. But why are they important? We already defeated the Russians. Oh wait, maybe we didn't. But why are they important, right? Why does China want to build this extraordinary partnership with many different countries for its infrastructure? What does it hope to gain from that, right? Oh, they just want to rule the world. Really? That's what China wants to do? They want to change the world and they want to do all this stuff? No, they're always 6 months away from a revolution. They just want to keep people employed, right? Let's be honest, right? China has a lot of people from rural areas going to cities that don't have jobs right now. And they got to figure out a way to keep them employed so that they don't rise up against the Communist Party. So, that's what they're doing. They're doing the same thing we did, right? We went around the world with economic hitmen and said, hey, you need a highway here. Oh, Bechtel can do that for you. And that's fine, right? But that is a framework. At least the Chinese are putting forward a framework. It's now time for the Atlantic Council and all of you to work together to take the Paris Agreement, to take all the work we're doing in the resource efficiency economy, all of the great technologies, most of which were invented in the 1970s after the Arab oil crisis, but have never been deployed at scale, and figure out what it is that you want to do to make your lives better, right? Because without that, as we can all plainly see, we're going to end up in anarchy. With that, thank you very much. All right, I think I was asked to take questions. All right, what you got for me? Anne. Microphone's coming.
Oh, thank you. Hello, Jigger. I was hoping that maybe you could talk a little bit about utilities and how, and the grid, and maybe how we're doing things differently, successfully or unsuccessfully in the U.S. and some of the things, we have an energy institute here at the Atlantic Council, so just looking, and we also have a center on resilience, so some lessons learned and some smart ways forward.
Oh, easy question. No. Electric utilities. Everyone knows what they are? Okay. So electric utilities are an interesting beast. Many of them are celebrating their 100th anniversary in the United States now. They were set up for one purpose, right? Because they believe that having 6 different, wires going down 3 blocks of New York City was not a great outcome, right? And that instead we should have a monopoly entity that actually just provided universal electricity for the people, right? And so we gave folks monopoly status. And when you give folks monopoly status, by definition, they're sort of a government agency, right? The fact that they actually have public shareholders and all that stuff is sort of beside the point, right? No one believes that the CEO of Pepco here in DC is Jack Welch reborn, right? They sort of think he's sort of a government bureaucrat, which is great, right? Because you kind of want people to do their job and provide good services to people. And they're regulated by Public Service Commission. So I was asked by one of these utility companies, Lord knows why, but I was asked to speak at their board meeting. And I said, well, you've read all the things I've said about you, right? Yeah, we just want alternative thinking. Fine. Okay, so the VP of customer service was in the room, and I said, well, what do you do? I knew the answer, but you sort of ask anyway. I run the national accounts, right? So there's 150 people who work for me. They all have national account customers. So if you're the owner of this building, you're important enough, you get assigned a national account customer, right? And so if you have a problem, you call them up. You say, hey, I was running this conference, lights went out. I thought that was really dumb. I wish you'd turn them back on. You have someone to call. I said, of the requests that they make, right? How many requests do they make a week? Said, we get 600 requests a week from these national accounts. I was how many do you say yes to? Less than 4%, right? The other 96% of requests that they get, they say, we're not in that business. We're not here to help you with electric vehicles. We don't care to give you much higher quality power. We don't want to help you with VAR support. We don't know what to do on your backup power supply. That is something that a third party does, which is why I started SunEdison. And that's why I provide those services to people, right? And so the weird thing about the electric utility industry is they are an outsourced group, so politicians don't have to understand what this is, right? So if you're the President of the United States, are you an expert in electricity? No, of course not. You're an expert in getting people to vote for you. That's great. So then the question becomes you want the lights to stay on, right? So then you say, well, I should have a council. Great, let's have a reliability council, the National Reliability Council. We'll bring these people together, they'll tell me what they need. And they'll tell you, well, here's how I make money, right? They don't actually answer your question. They say, here's how I make money. I want to build bigger plants. I want to build more transmission lines. I want to build more stuff. And then the customer ends up saying, well, I don't want any of that stuff, because that ends up being a 4.5% rate increase per year. Inflation's only 1% a year. That means rates are going up at 4.5 times inflation, and that's not good, right? So that only goes so long until the politician hears from the customer and says, hey, that National Reliability Council that you have set up is not doing what I need them to do, right? Or that nuclear plant in Georgia is really costing us a lot of money. And suddenly AARP stands up, right? The American Association of Retired Persons, people over the age of 50, come together and say, we don't care about electricity, but we hate this nuclear plant. Why? Because it's raising our rates 30% in Georgia, right? And so you have these weird things where electric utility companies are now in the crosshairs, right? And they're being told, we hate you. We hate you. And so J.D. Power and Associates does these studies, right? And guess who the most hated utilities are in the country? It's actually Comcast. But the second most hated utilities in the country are all utility companies, right? So now S&P, right, the famous group that let us all down in 2008, they say that we are going to put a watch on everyone's bonds in the utility sector because they're so hated that it's entirely possible that when they go to the next regulatory commission meeting that they are denied their rate increase just because people hate them so much. So when the S&P says people hate you so much that we're actually going to put your bond rating on a watch because it could mean that you're not going to be able to raise money and repay the bonds, you're probably doing something wrong. And so now the utility companies are saying, hey, Jigger, you should come speak at my board meeting because that would make me look good. And so, and we should do more wind, and we should do more solar, and we should do all this stuff, right? But going back to my speech, that's not a framework. That's not a framework for decarbonization, right? Do you guys think it's a framework for decarbonization? No, I don't think so, right? So that's a framework for getting paid $25 million a year to be CEO of a company that's not really doing that well for 3 years longer until someone else can take over the reins and then they can deal with it, right? And that's the problem with the electric utility industry is that, and the oil and gas industry are similar, where these are extraordinary people. I used to work at BP. I don't know if you guys know John Brown and Sir Mark Moody Stewart and some of these just extraordinary people. They've been replaced by far less extraordinary people. But in any case, and when I say that, it's because those folks really understood this world order that we were talking about, right, and how it worked. The folks who replaced them were really back to basics, right? Let's stop doing all this, anything that's interesting, solar, wind, whatever, and let's just drill more oil. The CEO of Shell recently, who has admitted that climate change is real, thank God, is saying basically, well, renewable energy is all well and good, but it cannot power the world, right? And so that's sad, right? It's sad for someone who's so smart and so talented, who has a scenarios group and all these other resources, to lie to you, right? And why would they lie to you, right? And it's not because he cares. I mean, he doesn't produce enough oil to matter, right? I mean, it's all the national oil companies who actually produce all the oil. The private sector oil companies produce less than 15% of the world's oil. So they don't really matter, right? But why would he do that? Because what we're talking about here is hard. It's really hard. We need all of you. We need lawyers and doctors and dentists and engineers and psychologists and all of you to come together to help us figure out what this new framework looks like. It's the reason why ExxonMobil wanted to stay in the Paris Agreement, because they understood that the Paris Agreement at least is a framework, right? It may not be a framework that we wrote, but it's a framework by which we can do business, right? And exiting that framework means that we're left without a framework, which is not a really great place to be, right? So, okay, I don't know if I answered the question. I think there's one here in the...
Hi, Jigger. Nisha Desai. I'm from Deutsche Bank and a Millennium Fellow. We just had this amazing trip where we got to go to Morgantown, Virginia, and Pittsburgh and talk to some of the Rust Belt folks.
Yeah.
We visited a fracking site and a clean coal plant. And what was fascinating is that all of the locals in this area didn't want this Ohio-based First Energy company that's going through some distress right now to relocate its plant in their regulated market for a sort of a guaranteed return. And what we were wondering is what part of your framework essentially entails letting some of these energy companies just fail rather than engaging in regulatory arbitrage, whether it's relocating in a regulated market or like with Energy Future Holdings becoming a REIT effectively. My industry, banking, has often been told, let them fail, don't let them be too big to fail. And to what extent should that also be carried over to the energy sector?
That's a good question. So I think it's important to start the conversation with sort of what happens if they fail, right? I mean, this is a big conversation that the Germans had with RWE and others, right? That hasn't been bad, right? So what's happened with RWE is they've sort of restructured. They created two different companies, like one sort of the renewable energy hopeful company, and the other one's like we're dealing with all liabilities company. And so it doesn't mean that the people in First Energy's territory are all going to go into darkness if First Energy fails, right? What it means is basically that First Energy CEOs have really made bad choices, right? They decided to invest in coal plants when we told them that they were bad investments, right? I mean, Aubrey McClendon, myself, Carl Pope, others in 2007, 2008 went to First Energy and said, this plant will become a stranded asset in the moment you turn it on. And he knew that going in. And then he built it anyway and said, it's all of your guys' fault. You changed the rules on me. You put all this wind and solar up there. Now that when I sell it into the PJM, like the prices that I'm getting are 40% cheaper than what I had before, right? Like, so who exactly is to blame for bad decision making is the question, right? And obviously, like all of us have to pay the price, right? At some point, like if they go bankrupt and the bonds get, like sort of paid 40 cents on the dollar or whatever it is that occurs, and then, Exelon, who seems to be the gobbler up of choice that people like to go to, like is told, hey, why don't you buy First Energy? They buy First Energy, and then they continue to provide the power, or AEP, because AEP is sort of their like sort of arch enemy and would love to just buy them just to like poke the guy in the eye. So like maybe they do that, but in the end, right? I think that I don't think in this particular case it destroys the supply chain of auto parts suppliers like it did with the big three, right? I don't think that it has any impact at all. We have 18,000 jurisdictional owners in the country for electricity in the United States. 2,000 utility companies, but then other jurisdictional owners, right? If one of them goes bankrupt, it doesn't really affect us, right? And so I think we should be very careful about who really is too big to fail and who's frankly not too big to fail, and in fact needs to fail, right? First Energy is the one who actually took all these cases around climate change to the Supreme Court because they, wanted to keep their coal plants running much longer. All right, last question. I have a minute.
Thank you so much, Jigga. Matthias Duwe, I'm head of the Climate Team at Ecologic Institute in Berlin. And I hope this is not sort of too cheap a question, but sort of building on your theme of the Paris Agreement as a framework and a global framework, I want to ask you about your reflections on the impact of the US withdrawing from that agreement and how important it is that, at least for a certain period of time into the future, the US decided to step out of that framework as a country. But in terms of the impact of, sort of on the ground in the US, where you might now have a disappearing federal legislative framework, but you still have that happening at the state level, and you still have utilities doing decisions on the basis of current energy economics. What's the real world impact of that decision and that framework not being around formally?
So when you're in the business of putting, of like having a model that's put $1 trillion out since 2003, you sort of separate the theatrics from the reality on the ground, right? I mean, I think, the reality on the ground is I need 27 permits to be able to build this plant, and you get OPIC approval and this and that, whatever else, and you sort of like have a checklist, and you go through the checklist and you get it done, and you build stuff, right? The Paris Agreement is not like, the U.S. can't exit the Paris Agreement. There's no real like ability to do that. For those of you who don't know the Paris Agreement, right? The Paris Agreement basically is you put forward your best efforts in terms of what your carbon emission reduction plan looks like. And then you grade yourself, right, on a curve, if you wish. And then you replace it with a new agreement. That's all the Paris Agreement is. All it is just a framework by which people can meet up and party once a year, talk about what you've done, what you haven't done. Hey, do you need some technical assistance? Sure, I'll give you some technical assistance. Oh, you want some money? That's great. We will introduce you to Deutsche Bank. And like all this stuff, right? And so that's Paris Agreement, right? The Paris Agreement is not some sort of like dictatorial thing. It's not like the Empire Strikes Back and the Darth Lord is coming up and shh. So the Paris Agreement is a framework, right? Why do we not want to go into the framework, right? Like we have a lot of major corporations in this country who want to sell equipment and solutions to lots of people around the world. So they're all going to participate whether the U.S. government is technically in the Paris Agreement or not, right? So there's no such thing as exiting the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is a new framework. It's like saying I'm exiting the Earth. You're not exiting the Earth, right? Like so I think we should start there. The question around whether the rhetoric out of the Trump administration is harmful, I think it's really helpful, right? I mean, when you think about it, we exited the Kyoto Protocol, right? To be clear, right, the Bush administration, first thing they did when they came into office said, we're exiting Kyoto, right? And so it's not like we haven't done this before. We like to do this. This is fun. And so now the Trump administration leaves the Paris Agreement, and all these mayors who literally haven't done anything, right? To be clear, right? Mayor Nichols has this climate pledge that he put out in 2008, and 1,000 mayors signed up. We only have 25,000 towns and cities in this country. 1,000 people set up. Nothing got done. Nothing at all. So now all these cities re-signed up, right? Because they're like, screw the president. We need to sign up. I'm hopeful that this framework and all of you now allows people to go to those mayors and say, hey, 10 years ago you kind of did the same thing and you didn't do anything. We really should do something this time. It'd be kind of cool, actually. Maybe electric vehicles, some solar on the roofs, some LED lighting, some big data, something. Give me something, And so now you have a framework by which to go and hold these people accountable. Institutes of higher learning, cities, all these other things. I believe this is the largest wealth creation opportunity of my lifetime. So I think everyone should be all in on this stuff. But I think that the Trump administration has provided real clarity and focus, I think, to individuals in this country around, if you want to do something, do something. If you don't want to do something, don't think that you've done something just by signing onto the Paris Agreement, right? That's not doing something, right? So with that, I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
We will now have a short coffee break. The next session will begin shortly.
Thanks for the Star Wars reference. That's fantastic. I appreciate that.
Please take your seats. The program is about to begin. If you can please take your seats, we will begin.
All right, thanks everyone, and happy to be here. My name is Jonathan Kirshner. I am a Millennium Fellow here at the Atlantic Council, and my day job is as a principal with the Omidyar Network, which is a family office based in Silicon Valley focused on social impact investing. And I'm really happy to be here with this panel. Let me do a couple of quick housekeeping announcements. So this one is on the record, so feel free, and in fact you are very encouraged to tweet using the hashtag AC Tipping Points. And we'll do kind of some brief introductions. I'll get us started with a few questions, but then I would love to involve the group. So please be thinking of areas that you'd like to cover. And we're going to focus really in this session on investing and on this interaction between climate and energy. And so part of that I want to also give a thanks to the EU and for their support. It happens to also be the EU Climate Diplomacy Week, which we are taking part of, and so happy to have them as a partner and supporter of this work. So let me give you a brief introduction to our panelists, and then I'm going to ask them to talk a little bit more about their work. So David Chang, directly to my left, is somewhat of an anomaly in this world. He's been working in one place for the past 16 years now at Wellington, based in Boston. He's a partner there as well as a portfolio manager for commodities. And so we'll ask him some questions around the specifics of that and also understand his evolution there with Wellington. To his left, Erica Karp is the founder and CEO of Cornerstone Capital Group. So is a founder, an investor, and a longtime investment banker. She formerly headed up the global research group at UBS for many years. And then Michael Dorsey is formerly an academic, was with Dartmouth for about a decade teaching on energy and these issues, and now wears a couple of hats, probably many more than I can cover, but is a senior program officer with the National Academy of Sciences, as well as the co-founder of Around the Corner Capital. And so I'd like to just start with David, and perhaps he can tell us a little bit about his work and specifically some of where that touches off on our theme for today of energy and the environment.
That sounds good. So I actually thought I would start a little bit with my own tipping point. And when Sam earlier asked us about our introspective 2007, my 28th birthday, the most memorable birthday gifts that my wife gave me, which was 2.7 trees. And at this point, you're probably wondering, who's this guy? How does one buy 0.7 trees, a fraction of a tree? And what is that? This in agriculture for a number of years at that point, and it was really the first time that I forced myself to think about the intersection between all of that. And it's interesting, 10 years later, and this is sort of the humility that investing for all the different scenarios, which is very humbling to me, but thinking about how important this environment is of transition, where we're seeing really tension both on the supply and the demand side when it comes to the world of commodities, certainly. On the demand side, thinking about the way that we have this emerging thirst for energy coming out of emerging markets. Today we have about, I believe, 1.4 billion cars. It could approach closer to 2 billion cars by 2030. So it's very considerable growth. So that versus the the increasing efficiency and conservation, and obviously electric vehicles, which today is a fraction. And then on the supply side, really the intersection and the tension that exists between conventional energy and renewable energy, but not just that, thinking even within conventional energy, the tension that's existing between natural gas and oil, between conventional oil as we've known about it for the last 100 years, and shale oil, which was just a pipe dream even 10 years ago. So I look forward to this discussion, but for me, really, the theme is sort of this balance and being more moderate in my outlook.
Great, thank you. Erica, I'll turn it to you.
So 2007 was an important year for me also. It's the year that I realized I had become fluent in the language of sustainable investing, or impact investing, or SRI, or double bottom line, or triple bottom line, or values-based investing, whatever the hell you want to call it. From my standpoint, it's just investing. And in 2007, I mean that. I ran a large global research department. And I had the privilege of managing, along with hundreds and hundreds of analysts that would come in and tell me they know everything about everything by stocks and sectors and economies. And of course, when they did that, I would say, if you think you know everything about everything, I will guarantee that you're either lying or you're stupid. So which is it? And hopefully, that prompted analysts to go out and pursue different avenues of inquiry. So research, the discipline of research, the discipline of investing, demands the systematic analysis of environmental, social, and governance factors. And so I started learning that language more and more and more. And when you have an analyst who wants to our clients, you really want to push a research analyst to give you incremental, non-consensus, value-added, stock-moving, proprietary research with a global spin, if possible. And so when you're trying to push analysts to get predictive insight, you have to look at those ESG factors that matter. And so you can use and costs and risk without using the word sustainability or without using the word impact. And when you do that, you avoid being divisive or ideological or politicized. You can engage everyone. You can use language that's inclusive and pragmatic and relates to an enhanced analytical process that, again, leads to better investment discipline. And so Cornerstone Capital is an investment advisor. We advise foundations, endowments, families, individuals on how to deploy their money in alignment with their values. And so we have clients, obviously loads of them, who are really interested in deploying their portfolios in a way that doesn't damage the environment. We have clients that care deeply about animal welfare, or about food safety, or about women's economic empowerment. We have clients that care deeply about everything from, supply chain transparency to, you name it, flipping the pyramid globally for economic growth. And so again, our job is to find investment opportunities that serve those clients. And the one thing that I have, 25 years on Wall Street, 15 at UBS, 10, 9 at Credit Suisse, the one thing that I came up with.
First is speed and sluggishness. Second is poverty and prosperity. And those two things sit atop, I think, a broader context of what I like to think of as decoupling. Many of you know what that is. So in terms of speed and sluggishness, last year, before joining the academies, I spent the same time on a megawatt deal in Michigan as I did on a 500 megawatt deal in India, about just a little bit more than a year. So a deal 500 times, literally, bigger on the other side of the world took essentially the same amount of time, and we're still dealing with some regulatory, I'll call it silliness in Michigan. So we're in a moment where things are changing quite rapidly. There's enormous speed. characterized by certain emerging markets, and even I think in this country, but there's a tremendous amount of sluggishness. And I think when we think about investments in energy going forward, we need to be focused on that reality, that sort of speed and sluggishness at the same time. There's many examples of that, which we can hopefully talk about on the panel. You look at what's happening in the state of Florida, I think that's an example of sluggishness. You look at other emerging markets, the examples of speed. What about poverty and prosperity? That's something that we're particularly concerned about in the work that we do. Certainly, it's a real big problem. Last year, there's roughly about, depending on how you look at the math, about $3 billion in change went into low-income EU. That it'll be quite easy to move from a fossil fuel oligarchy that we have now that's sort of dominating the planet to a green energy oligarchy. And I think that we need to commit more time to look at that particular problem. Why? Because those two things, speed and sluggishness, prosperity and poverty, they sit atop decoupling, which is playing out now. That decoupling means that over the past administration, we saw just under a 10% reduction in CO2 emissions over the arc of the administration. Administration I was proud to be involved in and support and so forth. And we saw at the same time roughly about 10% economic growth. That applies not just in the US, it's similar countries, particularly in the global north. That process, it will undoubtedly accelerate and is accelerating, but it goes back to, I think, forcing us to think about these dynamics of poverty and prosperity, both speed and sluggishness, because those things go together. And we need to really be thinking about the policy solutions and also in the way in which we do investments.
Great, thank you. And thank you all. I'm glad that we all came around the theme of 2007. And so we're 10 years later now. I wonder if you could help paint the picture of where you see this world going 10 years from now. Kind of laying out some of the key trends in terms of, we hear a lot about the transition to a greener economy, to a low carbon economy. In particular, let's focus on some of the key challenges that are making this more sluggish, and then maybe some of the accelerants that would enable us to really move money now, to kind of feel that urgency and to deploy capital more quickly. So happy to kick off wherever you'd like.
I kicked off last time. So.
Okay. I'm going to give, there's two big challenges in particular in the investment world. And remember, we don't need to move, millions or billions. We need to move trillions. And you guys know the numbers better than I, but if something on the order of, $500 billion is put into alternative energies and investment this past year, we need something like a $1.3 trillion is a number I've heard from Bloomberg if we're going to get to 2-degree scenarios. So in any case, trillions. And moving trillions, you need every piece of the capital markets. Right? In particular, the large asset managers, the asset owners, the investment banks. You need the regulators, the accountants, the exchanges. You need the academics. You need every piece of the capital markets, and you also need. Jigga talked about a framework. You need infrastructure and you need governance and you need a common language to some degree. So the challenge is that we don't actually have a common language. And so when it comes, as an example, to disclosures from corporations on material environmental, social, and governance factors, environmental is probably the easiest, social the most difficult, governance the most critical. But we don't have a framework for disclosure yet. We're getting there. Something called the GRI. I was one of the founding board members of the SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, but we need much better data, and we need much better accuracy in the data so we can really use it. Right now, the quality of the data, this is not my word, this is Dan Doctoroff, formerly of Bloomberg, the quality of the data right now is crap. And so, it's not my word, but that's a reality. So we need good data. Infrastructure, that's one thing. Another thing we need to put to bed the misplaced notion that if you analyze environmental, social, and governance factors in your investment process, you are going to get concessionary returns. You're not going to get market-based returns. That is a load, and if anyone believes it, we need to educate them. So the fact that that notion is still there, it's in the investment committees and boards of directors of the largest foundations and pension money in the world, we need to educate. And by the way, we do need to do it in an inclusive and non-divisive way, because what we've seen in the past is a little bit of holier than thou kind of, chest pounding. Someone said this to me, I can't remember who it was, but you don't sail by the Titanic and say your boat sucks. Instead, you sail by the Titanic and you say, it looks like you can use a hand, right? Inclusive. So we need better data with which to make projections. We need a confidence that ESG analytics gives you more information and better predictive insight. That's another. And again, we need the common language that will help us move those trillions. So those are a couple of things that are right now kind of blocking factors to moving the quantum of capital towards an energy transformation.
Great.
I mean, for us, I think one of the biggest, factors in sluggishness, as it were, is the sort of the uneven terrain of different, markets. I mean, and then also, and related to that, the uneven interest of different capital partners that, this one likes South Africa but doesn't like Southern Africa or the rest of Southern Africa. This one likes, Latin America but only, the Andes, or, and so, and then that problem coupled with so that's a worldwide problem, that uneven interest of capital. But in the U.S., I think the problem is that you have, a little bit of, and I think we might all agree, regulatory chaos. So many different, states that, give you different opportunities or no opportunities, coupled with the sort of reigning federal uncertainty and changes. I mean, those two things. I mean, they really make. They basically, for us, they really, jack up transaction costs. They cause, lots of problems, and they create a lot of uncertainty in terms of, how to go forward. And witness that the example of, being involved in a very small deal in Michigan, which oddly enough made us one of the largest investors behind the utility, at a size at which in some countries nobody would pick up the phone. I mean, nobody's going to talk to you for a megawatt in some countries. It's just not a conversation you're going to have. And then the time to do that deal was similar to a deal that was literally 500 times bigger. So those two big factors of the unevenness of interest in markets, coupled with the sort of the uneven, even more like stochastic, regulatory environment.
Yep. Yeah, maybe you can talk about the challenges and how this has evolved, how you sold this internally at Wellington, how this got some buy-in over the past decade.
Sure. So one of the things I was going to mention is, as a student of the markets, commodity markets, for me, prices are what dictate a lot of behavior, commodity prices. And interestingly, 10 years ago, one of the reasons why we were so excited about investing in this new strategy, which has been put in check today, is the fact that oil prices were very high, natural gas prices were very high, coal prices were also very high, and if anything, that was going to accelerate the adoption of renewable energy. And ironically, the idea of peak supply is something that was accelerating that trend. And 10 years later, we have a new source of energy supply in shale oil, which is a great thing for the U.S. economy, but at the same time, you might argue has slowed down the process, perhaps, as opposed to accelerate the process of adoption of renewables, because all of a sudden, natural gas is about 1/6 the price that it was back then. Oil prices are about 1/3 of the price, and so that transition, even though the technology curve is improving at a very, very rapid rate for solar, for wind, for other forms of renewables, the competitiveness of traditional energy has also improved quite significantly. And last year is a good example where the growth of electric vehicles globally was about 80%, year on year, which is just a tremendous number. And I'm sure by saying it, it's not the first time that you've heard it. At the same time, actually, we consumed in this country more oil than we did the year before, and that's because of the fuel mix, or the car mix went more towards SUVs, and we don't hear that as much. So I think the challenge is actually in a low commodity price environment, the adoption of these technologies is not as fast, and therefore requires a lot of the things that you've said, which is sort of the engagement of investors, the support of regulators. And I'll just finish with this one idea, which is coal. I believe Sally mentioned it earlier, and Sam did as well. Coal demand declined last year to the point where the coal share is today below 2004 levels after rising quite rapidly. And the UK had its first coal-free day since the Industrial Revolution, and yet coal prices doubled in price, doubled. So, and that's because regulation actually intervened in China to be removing a lot of coal supply. So ironically, higher prices of these conventional fuels led to some extent to the decline in their consumption, and therefore the acceleration in the use of alternative lower carbon emitting fuels.
Can I interject something?
Please do.
This coal conversation, is so interesting. In the U.S., we talk about, actually globally, we've talked about, economic growth. Capitalism, hopefully, is an engine for economic growth. And you would think that everybody would think about, again, the economics of coal as it relates to jobs. And people don't discuss that all that often, which they should, because, when you talk about building the economy on alternative energies, it is so incredibly job creating. If we do that right. In coal, I don't know if this is accurate, you would know, but I am told there's something on the order of 60,000 jobs in coal, and that's it. And half of them are administrative jobs. Whereas in alternatives, jobs are being created to the tune of 1.2 million jobs, I think is the number I heard, a year. So if we think about job creation, as we transform the economy, the economic argument is so clear, and I do not understand why that doesn't come up in terms of, driving the agenda that we need. So maybe you guys can answer that for me.
Yeah, just on this point, I think it goes back to Jigga's point, that, coal CEOs in this country and abroad, they've been lying to you. Coal has had, 1 foot in the graveyard and the other foot on the banana peel for 30 years. That's a point of fact. Very few, serious coal industry, folks would, if you talk to them seriously off the record, not when, when Hannity is going to put a spotlight on them, would lie to you about that. So the reality is not just what you said in renewables versus coal jobs, but just in energy efficiency jobs alone. You've got, 2.5 million people just producing the stuff for efficiency improvements, not producing panels or windmills, just efficiency. You got more people working in Texas in solar, not wind, just solar, than all of oil and gas combined. You got more people working in California in solar than all of entertainment. These are facts that this is the reality. There's no going back to this thing. If we want to think about something for coal workers, which, unfortunately, and this is probably the real, downside of this current administration, we need to think about, an adequate rescue plan, adequate support for those few workers. You've got more people in Walmart than working in all of coal. Right? We want to support those workers and certainly those communities and think about proper transition and economic transition of those communities. To have a conversation that we're going to revive coal. I thought it was preposterous. The president, when he backed us out of Paris, and I can say this because I said I'm speaking in my personal capacity. The comment was we're going to turn a coal plant on the next day. It turned on actually, a small one, about 60 jobs, owned by Canadians. So I think the comments are out of proportion with reality, and I think the industry knows that, and they're well aware of it. And I think that's a tip-off for serious people in the room to really think about those policy changes that we need to put in place. Because with respect to coal, that's dialed into the point I mentioned at the top line, the poverty aspect, right? Prosperity is playing out with respect to renewables, but there's still the poverty aspect that we need to think about.
Erika, your point actually it's an interesting question. When you look at what has happened in China, last year, the policies to reduce coal output led to several million coal jobs being lost in mostly the central parts of China. And actually, most of those jobs were absorbed. So these people were able to find other jobs. And so it's not 60,000. You can imagine one coal use and production is much higher in China than it is in the US, and it's much more labor intensive. Here it's mostly mechanized at this point. And so the fact that in that country they were able to really remobilize that workforce and is telling.
Yeah. You guys went to the issue of automation, and we talked about the idea of data, and we talked about the idea of good policy. And what I think is really interesting is the disproportionate impact that bad energy policy has on certain sectors. Even I think about women and again data, and a lot of people talk about the extent to which having women on boards makes for better corporate performance. That's an appealing idea, and there's some reports that reference that. The reality is it's not true. There's a meta-study out from Catherine Klein at Wharton, and that's not the one data point, women on boards, that drives good corporate performance. It's about governance. So you have to go deeper, and I guess that's really my point. On everything we look at, we have to go deeper. Women actually are disproportionately affected by automation. So that's an interesting fact in terms of policy implications. And so women in automation, or women in energy, women in healthcare, my point is that these are such nexus issues that we're talking about, that every human being in every region of the planet needs to think about energy, automation, change, having good data, good policies, but the whole thing gets better when we have transparency. And so I would argue that for capitalism to work, for the capital to flow where it needs to flow, we need two things. One is transparency, and another is collaboration, So each of the pieces of the capital markets need to move together. But good data, good policy, and good intent are a good start, so.
And we've talked about data a lot. We also, at the beginning, talked about personal experience and the power of narrative. And I wonder the extent to which you see those two sometimes in tension, or where they can be complementary in terms of when you go to your clients or working with your partners. How do you present this case to them? Are they looking always for the hardcore data? Are there certain things that are pulling on their heartstrings? How do you think about kind of representing ESG to this world of capital? Massive investors. I'm sure they want returns. What are the other factors that are driving their behavior when it really comes down to it?
I think it's a combination. They need the data, but they need the anecdote. And it needs to become visceral in terms of how you want to invest your money, principles. Data is critical. Actually, there's a construct called the trust quotient. And the trust quotient is the product of credibility times intimacy divided by risk. And so think about that. It makes a lot of sense. The credibility comes from the data and the knowledge and the experience. The intimacy is what allows for the connectedness to hopefully help move people. And you divide that by the risk, right? So if something is high credible, high intimacy, low risk, you're going to get it done. Everybody wants it. And then you think about how you use and what happens in each of those factors. And so it really, in my view, it's a combination. And hopefully firms like yours, firms like mine, bring the credibility, the institutional understanding of the capital market system to the world of impact and sustainable investing. So I think it's both.
I contrast maybe the current environment to a few years ago, where ESG is on the minds of all of our institutional clients. And so if we go into a meeting unprepared to talk about it, where it's going to become very clear because the topic is going to come up. And at the same time, so there's in front of clients, at the same time there's internal conversations. And this whole topic of ESG as well as climate change is not something that just impacts utilities and energy anymore. It's impacting transportation, it's impacting technology, it's impacting finance, the financial sector. So it's much broader, and all of a sudden it's really the entire firm that's coming together to talk about it, as opposed to a much narrower set of analysts and investors as in the past.
And this is why Wellington just stole one of my thematic analysts. That's not okay. I'll train more. Okay.
I mean, I think for us, it hasn't been this sort of broken, this dissonance between, a narrative and data, as it were, because maybe we've been lucky. We've had the opportunity to deal with people that we didn't have to hard sell, on solar primarily and a little bit on wind. I think the bigger variable with some of them, has been the time that they've waited. Particularly the larger, projects. People have been waiting around to do this. They've been searching for partners. And that's been a bigger problem than having to explain, the value of this endeavor. At least for us, and we've seen this not just in the U.S. but abroad as well, where people have been, either trying to convince partners, or trying to convince regulators, or trying to convince businesses, and so forth, that we need to do this yesterday, and then searching, and people are convinced, but they're still searching. We need the right partners. The project that we did last year in Michigan. The group that came to us had been working with the local utility for almost 5 years with no success, sort of in an infinite loop with them. Oh, well, we'll get to you, we'll get to you, we'll get to you. And so after about 3 or 4 years, they began looking elsewhere, and they weren't able to find anybody to help them. So it's been more of an issue of people are eager to get this done. And I think that speaks towards the future, particularly for this country, where there is, you hear this in the news and so forth, people talking about, well, will solar catch a roof on fire and this sort of thing. You hear that that kind of denialist noise that's going on. But increasingly, more and more and more, that is, something for, I call it the Bugs Bunny Roadrunner show. It's not something that serious people are engaged in. People are really getting the upside, the value opportunity. They're seeing the sort of the co-benefits. And I think that's happening here. That's definitely happening abroad.
Great. I could go on grilling them all day, but I'd love to invite you to join us. And so I don't know if there are any questions that are coming from the audience. I think there's a mic circulating. Yeah, why don't we start here?
Hi, I'm Andrea Elish, and I work at a sustainability think tank based in Europe. Thank you very much for your talk. I have a question to Erika. Thank you so much for the interesting thoughts, Gabe. So my question is that you mentioned that action needs to be inclusive and we need all these different sectors. And obviously today we spoke about the private sector, but I'm a policy analyst and I work on public policies. And my question is, what role do you see the public sector could play in impact investing and the issues that you covered? You mentioned disclosure, and I would be interested to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Well, these days that's a tougher answer, clearly. But again, now that we know, and it's proven beyond pretty much a shadow of a doubt, that impact investing doesn't need to be concessionary in terms of returns. So I would think that the most obvious thing that the public sector could do is provide, risk coverage to investing, to co-investing, to bring it down. Impact investors, and foundations, endowments are they're very small, but sometimes they're really catalytic. So I would think that some of the work that's done in terms of investing alongside could be really, really helpful for public policy. One of the things that is so sad, frankly, is that we're going to have a lot more unfortunate object lessons to get people moving. So when it's a senator or a congressman's own home and family that's lost because of a weather event that's supposed to only happen every 500 years, that happens every 2 years, when that person is touched by it, then they act. That's really, really unfortunate. So, I'm a little pessimistic in terms of the number of object lessons. When a senator is like, all for family values, and then their son turns out to be gay, and all of a sudden they're pro-gay marriage, it's like, wow. So these object lessons are going to come fast and furious. And hopefully that'll help. But again, to me, these public-private partnerships are critical. I would think in the infrastructure space, they're particularly critical. What I also worry about is the extent to which basic research in technology and healthcare in particular are not happening. That's really, really a problem. But I'm hoping that, again, the private sector can step up with the support. So it's got to be a new paradigm for progress. So that's a little bit of an answer. I can get you in touch with people who are much more expert in public-private partnerships if you want. Yeah.
There's also momentum that's taking place when, again, going back a few years ago, a lot of the interest in ESG and climate and impact and climate change investing came from endowments and foundations, which really aligns with the values of those organizations. But actually earlier this year, one of my colleagues who's our local expert on climate change spent the entire day with CalPERS, the California Pension Retirement System. And it was directed by the CIO of the organization for him to meet with as many people across the organization to influence the way that the organization thinks about this kind of investing. And that can be very impactful, right? So all the states have their own organizations that can direct assets into this kind of investing. And the interest is there not just because it's a good thing to do, it's really because the returns are there.
Yeah. Jack Ennis at CalSTRS, Deborah Schwartz at the MacArthur Foundation. Those are some, and we can get you plenty more. They're kind of thought leaders. At our shop, a woman named Catherine Pease is our director of impact investing, just coming in, so she'd have a lot of thoughts, so we can help you out on that.
And I will say, at the Omidyar Network, we do quite a bit of this work as well, where so we're the family office of Pierre and Pam Omidyar. He was the founder of eBay. They were quite fortunate, made a lot of money, have committed to putting that to work during their lifetime. We also spend a lot of time working with, in particular, other high net worth individuals and helping the broader ecosystem of impact investing. So there are a series of industry associations that are working on things like getting better data consistency, transparency, but also growing out of the work that was undergone during the previous administration with the National Advisory Board for Impact Investing. That continues on as more of an independent entity, and they are promoting a more conducive regulatory environment and making sure that there's an environment where that can prosper.
I want to do this with Pierre and Pam in Hawaii. That's what I want to do. That's what they are.
We'll do that next time. I think I had a question over here.
Hi, thanks so much. This has been a fascinating panel. My name is Danielle Fiddler, and I'm an ELEAP alum, and I work with the EPA. All of you have talked about the critical importance of data, good data, deep dive data, in driving this new energy investment. But a deeper dive into a data often ends up presenting a complicated picture that isn't simple to sell or to feel viscerally. So I have two questions. How do you rely on data, especially in trying to make investment decisions, in a climate of ideologically driven data? So you now have, Jigga was talking about this, right? So you have power companies coming to you, and I know so we just had a big election in Virginia, part of which was over, do we need this pipeline that's going to rip apart a big swath of land and use eminent domain? And the company's saying yes, and it's all actually kind of not very transparent, right? So, but you have companies who are in the business of making money on a certain model coming to you with a white paper, and you're forced to make a decision, and to invest in data is costly, it's time intensive to get really good, at the bottom information. That takes an investment, and in the past we had sort of a neutral arbiter of like universities and the government, government bureaucrats. I think it's safe to say that also is not as reliable as it used to be in terms of, we are seeing sort of grants and sort of being told to find the data to support what they want and to bury the data that doesn't. So that's one question. And then the other question is, how do you sell that complicated picture? You're talking about the need for a visceral response to get people to invest. How do you take a complicated answer and get a passionate response? So thanks.
The one thing I would say about this is the same thing Aristotle said, right? The perfect is the enemy of the good. And so you're right, this is a huge problem, and it's never ending, right? Because once you get better quality data, you want better quality data. And so people like us in the investment world, we make decisions based on imperfect information all the time, right? And that's why there is the institutional knowledge and experience does matter, because again, there's no perfection, and again, what you try to do, and I do think there are still some reasonably balanced institutions out there, and it's a question of understanding the agenda of those who give you the data. So try to understand the agenda and be conscious of that, and then just continue to get more and more data, know where it's sourced. The idea of actually, this idea sits in the impact investing world, which troubles me. Don't pretend to have, accuracy. False precision is something that bugs me a lot, right? And so when you look at the data, you say, okay, where can this be wrong? Where are the contradictions? What doesn't seem right? Right? And then be really honest about it, honesty and transparency. So again, there's no perfect answer. It is hard and it takes a long time, but we have to challenge ourselves, and then you can make a decision when you are as certain as you can be that you've got it right, and give yourself the flexibility to say, okay, I'm not going to be perfect. I'm going to do the best I can. That's my fair answer, Yeah.
I mean, I would say, as a recovering academic, as it were, I don't really believe this notion that there is this majority, not even supermajority, problem with data in the academy, in reputable spaces. There's actually a great deal of work about when people have an interest in data, how they corrupt the output. Shelley Krimsky and others have actually, some scholars have looked into this. So there's literature about that. So I think we do have this repository, and it's relatively strong and robust of partial, independent, scholarly, backed data, and I think at the same time, stepping out of that world, in doing investments, we do a lot of things, with this, from the vantage of imperfect information, and learning while doing that. That's part of doing investments. So, but I'm not so concerned as you sort of maybe put it in terms of, suddenly because you've got a few people that are on TV. Those are probably the first ones you don't believe in the first place, right? If they're on TV, that just put them to the side. But they don't really, I don't think, corrupt the true foundation of data. And I think the real sort of over the horizon is really how data is actually improving returns, and particularly in a lot of sectors. That's really the true future of data. And I don't think that's so complicated and so messy that we can't really explain it.
I know that we're at time. It looks like there are lots of hands with questions, persistent questions. I wonder if we might just ask them very quickly, and then I see one very urgent back there, and then hopefully we can convince our
So we
panelists
could do all
to
these questions with
step out
one-word
afterward.
answers.
Exactly.
One-word answers. Let's see if we can do it.
So maybe we can get these and then have these as closing remarks on the last couple questions. Thanks.
Danielle's question is a good segue to something I think about every day. My name is Sarah Hunt. I'm an ELEAP Fellow alum, and I'm the director at the Center for Innovation and Technology at the American Legislative Exchange Council. So I've also served for a time as the vice chair of the Environmental Disclosure Subcommittee of the American Bar Association section on energy and environment law. I think about these issues a lot, and I think about where the money is going on climate. It's not a mystery where insurance is. It's not a mystery where the investment houses are. How can I work with you to make impact investing a carrot and not a stick? Because we talk about visceral responses, and the audience that I have, which is 1 in 4 state legislators in this country and 1 in 5 members of Congress who are alums of ALEC, they have a visceral negative reaction to these issues and to impact investing, even when they see where the money is going, and even when they see that wind energy jobs are literally the #1 employer in a lot of rural districts in this country. So how can we work together to find that carrot and change that visceral reaction?
Cornerstone. Said one word, right?
Yeah.
Together, one word. So.
It's broad collaboration. It's
I won't limit you to one word here.
But I think it's not just convincing the traditional players that the returns are attractive in this sector, but it's really broadening the conversation across, especially those that you would expect are opposed and would fuel that visceral reaction. That's the most important, and finding your allies within there.
This is what I do every day, so if you'd like to help, please let me know. Anyone here.
So I think we're at time. I'm sorry that we didn't get to all the questions. I just wanted to leave you with a couple of thoughts. There were so many powerful images that came from this, so I won't try to summarize it all, but just a few things to keep in mind in terms of the power of narrative. This Bugs Bunny Roadrunner show image of how do we create a counter narrative. Also the importance of the trust quotient. So credibility times intimacy over risk, taking into account each of those factors. I think the coal transition, both the energy dimensions, but also the broader socioeconomic, political dimensions and the jobs part of that. We heard the image of one foot in the graveyard, another on the banana peel of the coal industry. How do we manage that transition smoothly? The object lessons, how many of these do we really need where we're hitting close to home with the key policymakers? And are there other ways to accelerate and get this on the agenda with those stakeholders to make sure that they're pushing this agenda? And so, we started with 2007. We're in 2017. I think it was a great conversation on how we might get to 2027 and just leave it with this fierce urgency of now, how we are all motivated and lots of opportunities to collaborate and work together. So please join me in thanking our panel. And there's no break. We're heading right into the next one, which was teed up in this one. It's the future of transportation and infrastructure. So I hope you can join, but feel free to take a sec if you need it.
I'm not joking.
If you can please take your seats, we will begin.
Scare them, man. Scare them. Let them know.
Please take your seats. The program is about to begin.
I don't know what order they're going to sit on, but I'm going to turn them all in.
Yeah. Please take your seats. The program is about to begin.
If I can do it twice, I can probably do it 3 times. I can hear half of that.
Press. Media.
I think there is. Okay, you're on the right.
There's also maybe a webcast or something here. So. Perfect.
I'd like to know the outlets, but part of me wonders. Okay. Good morning, everybody. We're still morning. It's always fun being the panel right before lunch, so we will take that into consideration as we go through this. My name is Catherine Cornum. I'm moderating this session on, I believe it's Transportation and the Future of Infrastructure. I work for the National Academy, specifically one of their divisions called the Transportation Research Board, and we do an awful lot looking at the future of mobility. We are researchers. We are always trying to figure out what is coming next. But you're not here to hear from me. You're here to hear from the panelists who are sitting up here next to me. So first, just going right down the line, we've got Mark Boris Andrijanich of Uber, a company that some of you may have heard of. Yes, also perhaps used. You may have seen the few headlines of late. Then we have Terry.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
No, none whatsoever. Terry Deo of Meridium Infrastructure. Then RJ Johnston of the Eurasia Group. And on the end, Sabrina Sussman for Federal Policy for the City of New York. So we'll start by just having everybody give a brief introduction about themselves and their organization, just a couple of minutes to kind of whet the appetite of everybody for the conversation that's coming next. So you're sitting right here, so you want to start?
Fantastic. Thanks so much for your kind invitation. Thanks so much to the wonderful Atlantic Council family. It's great to be here. So a word or two about this pretty much unknown company called Uber. So as you well know, our mission is to make transportation as reliable as running water, everywhere and for everyone. Now, our journey started in 2009 when we launched our service in our home city of San Francisco. Today, Uber serves more than 500 cities in over 70 countries around the world. By getting more people in fewer cars, we also help tackle some of the greatest challenges our cities face today. I'm talking, of course, about congestion and air pollution. Now, congestion costs Americans over $120 billion a year. Congestion and transportation in general also contribute over 22% of all CO2 emissions in the world. And what's even more alarming, transportation is the fastest growing source of CO2 emissions globally. Now, there are 2 main root causes for this quite alarming trends. The first one is rapid urbanization that we're witnessing all over the world. And the second one, which is really important to us, is quite an extremely inefficient use of private vehicles. Now, we might not be able to do much about the urbanization processes all over the world. They've been going on for decades. They'll be going on for at least a couple of more decades. But we can and we must do more to tackle the problem of individual car use. Just to give you a better picture of it, there are 1.2 billion cars in the world today. And although a car is usually the second greatest investment of any household, it sits parked for 96% of the time. However, it really does not need to be like that, at least not anymore. With modern technology, ride-sharing and carpooling became a credible alternative to car ownership and individual car use. And what's even more important, they tend to complement the public transportation options that are already out there by solving a problem that hasn't been solved for a long, long time. I'm talking about the problem of the first and last mile. Now, this is especially important for underprivileged communities that usually live in areas that are underserved by public transportation. We at Uber are committed to serving everyone, everywhere, without exception. So wherever you open your app in Los Angeles area, the nearest Uber will be less than 10 minutes away. And this is an area that covers more than 4,800 square miles. Today, as I said, we have more than 50 million riders and over 1.5 million driver partners all over the world. But this is just the beginning. So last year, only 4% of all miles driven were attributed to ride-sharing. By 2030, we expect the share to grow to 30%. Now, our vision of urban mobility goes, of course, far beyond the ride-sharing as we know it today. We're one of the leading developers of autonomous vehicles, and we were very proud to welcome this year's Millennium Fellows to our Pittsburgh Innovation Center, and it was great to take you all for a demo ride. The technology is there and it's working, as you all have seen. Now, a recent study by the OECD found that self-driving and shared mobility could reduce the number of cars on our roads by 90%. Now, just imagine what that kind of change can bring and will bring to our cities. So a better future is definitely within our grasp, and we at Uber are looking forward to working with national and state governments, as well as public transportation administrations, to make this vision a reality as soon as possible.
Thank you. Terry?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Thierry Deo. I'm the founder and CEO of Meridiam. Meridiam is a developer and investor in public infrastructure. So our mission is to actually manage money for pension funds and insurance company institutional money to bring solutions to communities in terms of infrastructure. And transportation and mobility has been, for the past 12 years, probably one of our biggest sector of activity, focusing on developing sustainable mobility. So we are rather diversified in terms of the modes of transportation, because our focus is really finding the solutions for the best solution for the city in terms of clean mobility. So therefore, we've been involved in a number of projects that involves urban roads, where we've been for the past 10 years involved in a number of congestion relief pricing roads. We've also been very much developing close to here the Purple Line, so rail mass transit system that can allow it to carry and have more people to travel, but also other type of transport from airports, LaGuardia or other things. So I'm very glad to be here today to sort of discuss the future of transportation. I think one simple comment I would make is those issues we've been facing for nearly 40 years now with rapid urbanizations in many parts of the world. There are quite a number of solutions that have been developed over the years. So obviously we're now facing more digitalization and a number of technology changes that are bringing new solutions, but I think if I were to find a constant theme within helping cities is how do we make them inclusive and how do we facilitate mobility for people to go to work and have a better life.
Great, thank you very much. I'm Robert Johnston, RJ, from Eurasia Group. I'm the CEO and I run the firm for the founder, Ian Bremer. I'm also a non-resident fellow here at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center. So I think my angle on the discussion today is very much from the energy point of view, which is my background, and particularly looking at the politics, geopolitics, policy, and regulatory environment at that space between the supply side of energy and the demand side of transportation. At Eurasia Group, we work very closely with a lot of global businesses and global investors that are looking at whether it's energy, financial services, transportation, trying to understand where there's both risk and opportunity linked to government action in a particular sector or market. So in the case of transportation, that's things like climate. It's things like public policy incentives for different types of infrastructure build out. It's the government favoring or supporting or penalizing one type of fuel over another through subsidies, as well as issues like security and elections and all kinds of fun things. So hopefully we can talk about some of that. And what I brought to the Atlantic Council on this topic is a project we're developing and we've written a little bit about on, which is really looking at the idea of resilience, right? The resilience of the global energy and transportation system that exists today, that's built on oil, but is being disrupted by these guys. So what does that actually mean? Not from the company side, I'll leave that to the investment bankers, but for countries, right? And what does it mean for the US? And also other levels of government as well, not just national governments, because a lot of these issues play out at the state and local level, as I'm sure we'll hear today. What does it mean for the OPEC countries? What does it mean for the oil sands in Canada? What does it mean for the deep water producers? What about refiners, right? And conversely, as we transition to intelligent transportation or clean transportation, who are the geopolitical winners? Is it going to be based in Asia? Is it going to be Europe? Is it US? And what stems from that? So those are a few of the ideas I look forward to discussing today on the panel.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me. I have what is debatable either a tremendous honor or an immense responsibility of being the public sector representative today. And so being a civil servant in today's climate, in any climate, is a little bit of a challenge. But it is, for me, highlighted by the fact that as I sit here, the three gentlemen who spoke before me talked about consumers and clients and the folks that they want to help make the world better for. Luckily for me, they're talking about me, right? They're talking about the city of New York and our fellow forms of government, whether it be hyperlocal or international. And so my perspective on these issues is very much driven from a couple of places. Prior to working for the mayor, I served at USDOT, and so come from that federal aspect of how do we look at federal policy. And then went and spent a lot of time working on intelligent transportation systems. And so you somewhat ask, well, how did she end up in New York City? Well, I'll pose a question back to you first, actually. Can folks shout out a word that they think of? What's the first word you think of when someone says New York City? Busy. Empire. Jay-Z. Let's chat after, Miss Jay-Z. Sorry, I heard one back there. Gridlock. Finance. Dirty.
I was going to say pizza, but
pizza.
It's lunchtime.
And I would also say, if you haven't, and Catherine knows this about me, I tend to use Pizza Rat in some of my presentations.
Yeah,
if you don't know who that is, you can YouTube that later, but it's a little bit of a statement on the state of our subways at the moment, so I won't go too far down that road. So all of those words not only describe the city, the population, our citizens, but frankly, they describe our infrastructure. And that's what's so fascinating to me about New York, is that that is a place where infrastructure, whether it be energy, transportation, housing, water, is so deeply tied into the culture of who we are. And so for me, I work on the federal portfolio for the mayor. I'm based here in DC and handle transportation, housing, economic development, labor, a couple other minor issues. But it is fascinating to work in an environment that is so defined by the choices we make in our infrastructure. No one can talk about New York in a way that does not highlight our decisions from 30 years ago, from 40 years ago, from 50 years ago, or our decisions from yesterday. And so whether you're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, whether you're talking about the use of energy, whether you're talking about moving our 8.5 million people around, That doesn't count the tourist. Those are decisions that sort of we live and breathe with every day. And as a city that is larger than some states and has an economy that drives 10% of the US economy, those are influential decisions that we have to struggle with, all while remembering that at the end of the day, we're just home for a lot of people. And so while we might be all of those things to the world and to the broader community, to 8.5 million people, we're just where the grocery store, the doctor, the school, the home, and the pool is. And so how do you balance those priorities on making sure that people can live the lives that they want, move the way that they want, while also helping to support a broader economy? And so those are some of the things I'm sort of thinking about and happy to share more about.
Thank you all. And before we open it up to everybody else, and I'm sure you've got some questions that are starting to percolate in your mind, a couple of reminders. First, in an era of social media, we strongly encourage you to get involved with this on social media. The hashtag is AC Tipping Points. So you can follow along with that, record your thoughts there, and find out what the person on the other side of the room is thinking if you're following that hashtag. Also, this session, as you have probably heard throughout the day, is on the record. So don't be in your comments that you make, either those of you on stage or those of you in the audience, don't share any state secrets or pass along any classified information to anybody, because that will get out. So we also are streaming live. So if you want to relive this session later, you should be able to find it on YouTube, or if you want to pass it along to anybody who you think would benefit from the wonderful conversation that is likely to happen. So my initial question for the four of you, given that we are at a conference called Tipping Points, what do you think the major tipping points in the transportation world are with regards to energy usage, to encouraging a low carbon future? Have we hit them yet? Are we anywhere near them? I'm happy to go in any order that we like.
I'm a consultant, I talk a lot, so I'll jump in. I think in my world of oil and gas and energy, I think we are probably at a tipping point, although there's obviously a debate about what the exact nature of the tipping point is. Right, some forecasters suggest that we are already very close to a peak in demand for petroleum. Others say that we're approaching a peak, or we're going to have a gradual decline or something like that. To my point, it doesn't really matter. The tipping point that's already happened is that the world's need for high cost, high risk oil is dramatically lower now than it was 5 or 10 years ago. So for example, the industry has already given up drilling in a bunch of places that don't make sense economically anymore. The Arctic probably being the most prominent example, certain parts of the oil sands, certain parts of deep water plays around the world. So that's a huge shift in allocation of capital already. And that's at a time when the public policy and market and technology changes are still in a very early stage. So I would say the minimum, we're at the beginning of a tipping point there.
I think one of the big tipping points, and I think we don't want to be talking about the elections in many countries in the world for the past year, is that people, and especially people in cities, are feeling excluded, especially those on the outskirts of the cities. And we are in an era where solutions for mobility and cleaner mobility have become a very, very important topic. And if I look at what happened at the COP21 a few years ago in Paris, and when I talked to the investors community, for me, that was a tipping point, seeing them thinking, oh God, we've got to actually do something. They were sort of aware of it before, and there is now a common understanding in terms of investing for infrastructure and clean and sustainable mobility in cities, a real awareness from the investors community in terms of a no return point. So I don't see anyone thinking about financing anything that could be carbon emissive in the near future, and with quite a lot of certainty, despite whatever may happen on the political side. I think the world of financing has really turned around into one direction, which is low carbon in relation to transportation and mobility.
So I would say that that's a really interesting point, because to me, tipping points are about people. They're about sort of when you get to a point of demand, that is overwhelming. And I think when you talk about a mobility network, when you talk about a system, and you look at, for example, New York City, what are we responding to? We're actually responding to public demand and inquiry. When people say that they want faster commute times, safer travels, less carbon emitting options, it's really a reflection, I think, of what they're looking for and what they expect of their government. The third piece to that, though, is when do investors, when do the private sector stand up and say, we're seeing this demand, this is what we need to be responsive to? Because there have been other times in our history where private investment and the public demand are not necessarily as aligned as they could have been. So I think one of the things that we're looking at right now is where do you spend your money in response to the public? Does the private sector see that as a good ROI for them? And then how does that formulate policy moving forward? And I think whether it's conversations about a bike lane or conversations about a new airport terminal, those do come down to individual demand and request.
I agree. I think we're hitting a number of tipping points. I would actually highlight three. The first one has to do with infrastructure, the second one with electric mobility, and the third one with the change of behavioral that we're already witnessing, especially among young people. When it comes to infrastructure, more used to be better. Right now, smarter is better. We need to think twice before we make huge public investments for several reasons. First of all, we're out of money in many, many places. Second of all, whatever public investment in infrastructure you make, it takes a long time to carry it out. And the third thing, behaviors are shifting. And we will be seeing a decline in car sales. We are already witnessing this trend in many areas across the world. So more roads probably doesn't mean more mobility opportunities. I think services like ride sharing can offer and sometimes not just complement but also substitute certain public investments, and they come at zero taxpayer cost, which is something that all of the governments across the world are looking at. When it comes to electric mobility, I think we hit a major tipping point. So electric mobility actually pays off. This is something that we at Uber try to popularize big time across the world. Right now we have a number of projects ongoing. We have hundreds of electric vehicles already operating across the world, especially in places like London or Portugal, as well as Madrid. And as I said, the technology is already there. We're not doing it for corporate social responsibility, but because it pays off for our driver partners. It's not just...
I hope it's for both.
It is for everyone. And this is, I think, the major shift that will drive the future of mobility in the next couple of years, especially in the time before the self-driving vehicles arrive. When it comes to the behavioral change, this is, I think, the most dramatic one. A lot of young people rely on ride-sharing instead of their own cars. 10% of millennium users of Uber do not want to have a car. They do not even want to have the driving license because they feel that they do not need it. And this is major. Now, this is, of course, going on primarily in the United States, where these services are available for quite a number of years, but we're seeing these trends also elsewhere. So expect the shift towards more services like ride-sharing and much smaller use of cars, or let's say ownership of vehicles.
I mean, car is king in the US, but in most of the rest of the world, mass transit is actually king. So I think that theory works very well in a place where a car is 90% of the mobility offer. But you can actually make major investment in infrastructure, in rail, for example, in other type of things. And even the electric car will need something to sort of drive on. So I think I don't disagree with Osti's point that there is an issue about sort of long-term sustainability and resilience of the system and infrastructure, and not necessarily being reactive to the changes of the millennials or the perception, but we do need to think about what is it going to be in 20 years, and what is it going to be in 30 years, and what sort of assets will be stranded assets that we actually don't want to be investing in today. And you're right, we probably don't need tons of roads add-on, but it's a very difficult question for public official to be able to answer, and that is why a number of the private sector players do engage with them on trying to prepare that future, because I don't think there's a magic one, and I don't think there is an easy solution, nor everything should be bespoke in a way. I mean, we work, for example, with the Rockefeller Foundation on their 100 Resilient City, we've signed an official MOU with them to really support that reflection, and a number of other private sector companies that can work from the financing, the construction, the technology, and this is an ongoing dialogue. And I think, to me, that's also a big change, between social media and the awareness of the public in terms of their health, their demand for mobility is so strong that it needs to be taken into account in a constant dialogue. It will never stop, and it will keep on going and evolving as technology evolves, but also as those demands evolve, and as elected official has to answer those questions.
I think the point about stranded assets is a great one, and I think our clients in both the Wall Street side and the business side, we've already seen that play out in the electric power sector, where coal is increasingly stranded certainly in the US and Europe, perhaps in Asia down the road. What will that look like in the transportation sector, right? Obviously, in the US, Europe, Northeast Asia, we have 100 years of investment in gasoline infrastructure. But I'm really interested in India and in Africa, where they haven't made the same scale of investment in that particular system around gasoline and diesel and filling stations and everything that goes with it. There's certainly some, but they have a big opportunity to sort of take these models these guys are talking about for alternative systems that are more about ride sharing and mass transit and less about passenger vehicles and medium and heavy duty trucks. And given the population growth there and economic growth there, that may ultimately be what makes the big difference.
I think they may have a chance to start something cleaner from the start.
Yeah, because I mean, if you look for the demand growth, it's not in the US and Europe anymore, right? It's not really even in China. I mean, China's oil demand is now growing 3% a year, right? India's still growing 8-9% a year. So that suggests that the transportation side is still booming there, even though it's slowed down a little bit more in China. So what happens in India will make a huge difference for the climate, for oil, and so forth.
So, I mean, I would also contend that when we talk about investing in infrastructure, it's sexy, significantly sexier, to talk about new things, right? To build things, to have a big red ribbon that allow elected officials to stand there, cut them, speak from a podium. But the reality about investment is that for some reason we've allowed this idea to permeate over the years that investment is a one-time thing, that our resources, whether they're stranded or not, are things that we bought at some point and therefore we use moving forward. And I actually think that when you talk about what the future of investment looks like, energy efficiency, what our assets are, a really missed opportunity is this idea that says you don't buy an investment at one point. You don't do infrastructure in a single moment in time. Infrastructure is a lifetime commitment for the length of the asset. And so in the transportation world, right, we talk about the state of good repair, keeping our bridges structurally sufficient, keeping our things at a place where you're not actually costing the traveler more because your roads are in such a state of disrepair. So what happens when we start to talk about not just investing from scratch, but changing the conversation on how we reinvest in things that have already been built? Unfortunately, that's not a subject that lights up eyes of investors at times, but is actually, I think, the thing that can change the way in which we allow behaviors to modify. If suddenly our streets, our bridges, our rail systems, our transit systems were up to par, we're not struggling, we're not deficient, how would that change utilization behaviors?
My lights are up.
I was just saying, yeah, you probably like that idea.
You're preaching to the choir here. I mean, public-private partnership and performance-based long-term contracts are the solutions to this problem. And clearly, the lack of use of this type of procurement in the US has resulted in this D- or D+, depending on the day, infrastructure level. But if you do focus on that initial investment and keeping it as your own house, maintaining it, and in 30 years have something that is actually worth something rather than something you need to just tear up to replace, which has been the way that infrastructure has been invested in the past, then you're really defining different cycles, and investors, especially pension plans, because this is people's money who actually want to make a difference in their own constituency, they can see, and they would be very, very interested in really be a part of something, creating an infrastructure that will be still worth something in 30 years. I mean, in terms of an asset liability discussion for investors, that's a very passionate one, and it actually fits the need of people.
When it comes to infrastructure, let me paraphrase Dwight Eisenhower, who said that planning is everything, but plans are useless. With the scale of disruption we're witnessing right now in all of the industries, including transportation, it's really impossible to make 30-year plans. Now, even in much more traditional industries like energy, the peak oil was predicted probably 100 times in the past 20 years. And all of the predictions, including the ones that were made for a year or two in advance, were proven wrong. And we're not talking about a high-tech industry, which in energy clearly isn't. So
we can talk about that one.
Yes. There's a lot of innovation that I agree with. Now, what I would say is that there needs to be more collaboration between public and private players. Why? Simply because all the investments that are being made, or let's say all the public investments, have to be targeted a lot better than they used to be. Not just because of the scarce nature of resources available, but also because we need to fit the needs of our citizens tomorrow or next year, not in 5 or 10 years' time. How do we do that? Now, at Uber, we have very good partnership with a number of cities across the world, and we share traffic data with them so that they can actually determine public investments in a lot more cautious and smart manner. As you know, every Uber is basically collecting traffic data, and therefore we know quite well how the city moves, and we're very willing to share this data.
You can do that with cell phones nowadays.
Exactly.
You sell Uber very well, but...
But what I'm saying is that government should rely on companies like Google. They don't everywhere. This is the problem. And we can see very big investments made unnecessarily, even today.
Well,
and we need to be targeting them better, not just in the developed world, but predominantly in the developing one.
No, I think it's also our responsibility as private sector to engage with government, and that was my point before. You're right, you can't do a plan that is going to be fixed. It's a constant change of planning, and so it's a constant dialogue between the constituency, the public sector leadership, and the private sector, but everyone has a responsibility in that trilogue, if you want. And if you, as a private company, sort of sits there and wait for both of the parties to do things, it could be disappointing. So I think the big challenge nowadays is how do you provide incentive to all parties to actually have a constructive dialogue, because voters, they tend to be angry every 4 years, and they tend not to be engaging too much in between. But the public sector officials tend to be excited a year before election, and in between, they lose focus. And so we do have to find incentive for each of the parties to continue to engage, to be in a dynamic planning, not a static planning, and at the same time use the resources from all the sides to be able to provide the best solution for mobility or for anything else.
One more question from me before opening it up to the audience. The Department of Energy in the last several months put out a report entitled The Transforming Mobility Ecosystem, Enabling an Energy Efficient Future, which was apparently brought to you by the letter E. But it points out that between now and 2050, depending on how we handle transportation and all of the trends that are coming our way, the energy use required for transportation could decrease by up to 60%, or it could increase by 200%. So there's a bit of a range potentially coming down the pike at us, depending on how we, as public policy officials, as consultants, as everybody in this room, decide to handle energy with regards to transportation. So of the three major trends that could potentially affect transportation energy use, those being electrification of vehicles, sharing of vehicles, and automation of vehicles, which of those do you consider to be the most important for reducing energy efficiency? Are we focusing on the right ones at this point?
So I'll start by not answering your question.
Got it.
Instead, I'll say the following things. In 2016, New York City DOT released their strategic plan. And reducing greenhouse gas emissions was one of the centerpieces of that plan. Specifically on, in our mobility section, we talked about how we can accomplish those goals. And frankly, the things that we focused on were increasing bus travel speed in New York. This is an issue. Decreasing individual car speed for safety purposes, right? Mobility is also about safety. So you've heard of our Vision Zero program. Ensuring that people have equal access to bike lanes. Having a very serious conversation on how goods movement is one of the largest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions and how we could make policy and strategic changes to modify that. So in my attempt to not answer your question, what I'll say is the following, is that it's definitely broader than the three that you've laid out. When you ask what's the most important of those three, the response to a certain extent is time frame. If you're talking about 2050, that's realistically 30 years away. So does full autonomy across the nation get us, are we there in 30 years? Are we there to the extent where we can completely transform energy use? Is electrification there in 30 years? And so I know that there are folks in the room who are absolutely on autonomy and absolutely on electrification. And I think I would come back and say the answer is D, none of the above. And instead, it's a patchwork. If we sort of pick one star horse, which I think is sometimes the gut reaction in situations like this, we won't get there by 2050. Because the transportation network is significantly more complicated than having one star horse drive us across the finish line.
Yeah, we'd have to move from, we're 96 million barrels a day of oil consumption, 2/3 in transportation, right? So that's the scale of the challenge that we're up against. I think all three are important, and I agree that a portfolio or sort of patchwork approach is right, and there'll be geographic and even cultural differences in terms of what people want. But the one thing I would add that you didn't mention is I think you have to penalize oil and gasoline and diesel. Is that a carbon tax? Is it a congestion charge? Is it slowing down the taxis? All the above and more. Because I don't think the incentives alone are enough to get people to shift. I think when you talked about the Clinton campaign and some of the things they were talking about, or Bernie Sanders, some of these ideas for controlling the supply side by banning fracking, even that's the more extreme end. But even things like carbon tax on gasoline, at some point, if it's painful enough, that will incrementally shift people towards not things other than driving their own internal combustion engine powered vehicle.
I agree. Let me just do a little bit of advertisement for public transportation as well. So I think actually that this
it might be a new business for Uber.
You never know. So public transportation definitely is the backbone of the transportation ecosystem, and it should remain such. We need to strengthen it. We need to make it a lot more energy efficient. Plus, I would say all of three options that you mentioned go hand in hand. Particularly, of course, the electric mobility and the shared mobility. It's still early days when it comes to autonomous mobility, and we're not quite yet there. But when it comes to shared mobility and electric mobility, we are looking at, 2020 or 2025 being the tipping points for mass use. Now, I think technology might not be there when it comes to autonomy. When it comes to electricity, some are still struggling, so more investment in research is needed. But carbon tax would definitely solve a lot of these issues. So I'm personally, supporting it because it's also a just solution, not just a right one.
I mean, I would add that I think we're being too complacent by thinking that technology is going to solve everything. And because all the ABCs that you gave were sort of technology disruption, I would add, mass transit, because mobility of many more people, if you don't massify the whole thing, it's not going to work. So what other modes of transportation can we use beyond the car, even the clean car, even the electric car, to actually reduce the number of, the energy consumption? Second is people's way of living will be evolving. How do you plan cities so people don't necessarily have to travel an hour a day to go to work? There is, working from home, which is something that has been a huge shift in the work habits of people, have changed quite a lot and impacted transportation quite a lot. But disruption also brings terrible things for transportation. I was talking to some of City of Paris official. What is the biggest problem of Paris today is with the jams is this Amazon deliver in an hour that has created enough jams in the past year to actually make the city such a gridlock. And so you have it's holistic, and I think it goes from people's behavior, different ways of life, the way we plan cities, the way things are delivered in cities, including the mass transit and the new technologies in transport that will be part of the solution. But I'm not a big believer that technology solves everything, because it makes everybody lazy in terms of just waiting for the next
No, and as you
disruption.
said, there's sort of unintended consequences or externalities, right? That with electrification, for example, in many parts of the world, especially Asia, it would be powered by coal, right? So if you're talking about climate goals and things like that, it's not necessarily an immediate win on that side. And even in the U.S., we're still 35, 40% coal. So that those types of things have to be factored in as well.
Can I just add one thing? Sorry, can I just add one thing on electric mobility? So it's not just about electric cars. You need to have the enabling ecosystem that goes with them. So you need to have, the infrastructure when it comes to charging station and many, many other things in place in order to make this electric vision a reality. Now, how do we do that? This is a big question. Why? Because convenience is something people care the most about. They will not buy an electric vehicle if they'll have to drive for an hour to the charging station and take another 2 hours to charge it. So we need to make it as easy as possible for the people to use these new technologies. And this is somewhere where cities must step in, and also through public-private partnerships ensure that this enabling infrastructure, let's say environment, is in place. We have a very good dialogue with a bunch of cities throughout Europe. In Portugal, actually, we have a special electric-only service called Uber Green in collaboration with some of the cities there, so it can be done. Now, this is, of course, a model that should be replicated all over the world, not just by us, but also by all the other players, as well as the car industry. And they have a very important part here.
Well, Sabrina, and then we'll open it up to the audience.
Well, and I don't mean to throw a wrench in, but
please do.
Please do.
But like, let's just be honest for a moment. We're sitting in Washington, D.C. If you've read a newspaper in the last 6 months, you'll see that the government structure right now is a little bit complicated, is I think the most gentle word to use. And so it's very easy for us sitting up here on the dais to talk about a carbon tax.
It's also easy.
But it's also very easy for us to say things like Amazon make congestion worse. Well, Amazon just bought Whole Foods, so me and my $7 asparagus water have to really contend with like what that means for life and what that means for personal congestion, as well as sort of the community congestion. But I would sort of challenge everyone here to say, let's be real a little bit about this. There are policy principles, and then there are the practicalities of whether it's public financing or private financing. And if I had the answer, I assure you that I may not be in this room at this moment, because I'd be somewhere else telling everyone about my answer. But I don't know that I've heard it today. Kind of punting and saying that we need a carbon tax and that will allow us to move forward, or that we need to take the technology and tamp it back from public demand. Those are options, ideals, but that's not how we sort of on the ground as citizens of the world, as practitioners of local government, are able to respond to our citizens.
But I think her question was, you know, if you were to get to this decarbonization, how would it work? I don't think any of us are saying it's actually politically possible, right? I think that you mentioned the term convenience. I mean, the voters are going to vote mostly on convenience, at least in the U.S., right? In Canada, where I'm from, other places maybe it's different, but I agree with you. I mean, those are real barriers. Question. Anyway, I know.
And what questions do we have from the audience? I know I saw you earlier, so.
My name is Scott Kolke. I'm an elite fellow. Used to live in New York, and you asked a question at the beginning, you know, what do you think of New York? And I actually think of cycling. And, you know, it took about 45 minutes before cycling was discussed. I understand this is a mobility, electric, you know, infrastructure, maybe bigger, thinking that way. But I recalled when I would go to my office, if I had to catch a cab, 35 minutes. Subway, 30. Biking, 15 to 20. I now live in Houston, a city that people don't associate with cycling, but you'd be surprised at how many cycling opportunities there are and their cycling plan, which I feel makes the city better. I feel it's what I think of the most when I think of New York. How is New York maybe promoting what's happened with City Bike, with bike lanes over the past 10 years, sharing that data to show that that cycling is a very good way of getting around. It's not a drain on your finances like owning a car is, or even, you know, calling an Uber every once in a while. How is that being promoted? I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Sure. So I think a couple of things. Number one is that it is an infrastructure investment that New York City has made. We've fundamentally changed the way New York looks in order to promote cycling. We don't shy away from the fact that one of our goals is to get more people on bikes. And whether it's your own bike, whether it's a city bike, we want you there because we know that it helps overall goals as well as it probably achieves your own mobility goals. You know, a couple of things. I think that people often associate cycling with the super urban Brooklyn iced coffee drinking person who's going to work, not to presume where you lived or what you drink in the morning. But the reality is I've been in Minneapolis when it was negative 13 degrees out and stood on their greenway and watched as hundreds of people biked past me. I personally would not be found cycling at negative 13 degree weather in Minneapolis, but demand is demand is demand, right? And so whether you're in Houston or Minneapolis or New York, for people to be able to say, this is a choice I want to make, and I'm asking for my government to reflect my own demand is an important piece of that. New York City, I think our changes have been largely in response to that demand. I think that the other thing that we have to do is understand that one bike lane is not enough. In order for people to consciously make a modal shift, they need to feel like it's reliable, it's continuous, and it's safe, which means that every day you can get to work on a bike. Every day you can not just get to work, but then you can go to dinner or your doctor's appointment and then home. And that throughout that process, you will be safe. And so one of, I think, our biggest investments has actually been in Vision Zero, and in making it clear that biking and walking are safe and consistent ways to move throughout a city. That's not something we started. We stole that from Sweden. We're open and happy to say that. But I think that demand of I want to be able to safely make my choice on how I want to move helps put some of that pressure on. We're working with other cities to share with them our successes, but some of them are transferable. Some of them, like in Minneapolis, are not as transferable necessarily to Houston.
One more question before we
Just,
break for lunch and keep everybody from getting too hangry, but feel free to
I would
add
just
in there.
like to say that I'm a huge fan of cycling and a big
You have an
fan
Uber
of
cycling?
Not yet. So that's an idea for the future. And I'm a big fan of the schemes that actually allow you to share bicycles. The bike sharing schemes that are very, very popular in Europe. They are actually great solutions for many urban environments. I don't know how far you are here in the United States in this respect, but this is definitely, how can I say, an aspect of shared mobility that should be emphasized in many, many cities, of course, if weather allows.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I've been a New York City resident for 9 years now. Use City Bike. I think it's one of the most responsive areas I've seen the city in. But as a taxpayer, I've noticed that the Second Avenue subway cost us $1.7 billion per kilometer. It serves 150,000 people in New York City, whereas peer cities like Copenhagen, Denmark, Berlin spend $250 million for the equivalent of a kilometer of subway. So I'd like to know from our private public sector experts here whether we're really spending our taxpayer dollars effectively, particularly after New York City is asking us to spend $14 billion more. I'm happy to support the citizens of this, the city who use that subway, but I just want to make sure we're actually commercial in that respect.
Before the private sector answers.
She's afraid I'm going to say something.
No, I actually, no. I'm really interested to hear what you say. But one thing I want to do is I want to ask, raise your hand if you know who oversees the New York City subway. It's the MTA. Yeah. And who oversees the MTA?
Union.
Cuomo.
The state, the governor. And how many representatives are of the entire board are New York City Central?
None.
Max of 4 at a time out of the 20 plus. So now
that she said she's
now that
not
I've
responsible,
said that, because I have
can
my
tell
own
you how
thoughts.
bad it
Please.
is.
Yes, please.
Okay, how can I put that politely? I think we do have generally in most government, and that's not only true in New York City, difficulty in evolving, in becoming efficient in public procurement. And part of that is that a number of cities over the years, and that was the old ways of doing things, you have your own city engineers or you had your own internal engineering group, and they love to design things themselves, and sometimes they use consultants, and they do more and more, and they love to control everything that's getting done. So their concept is we're building the things ourselves, we hire the contractors, we change our mind as we please, and as you go along, most public sector projects, and I'm not only talking about New York, there have been surveys in the UK, there's been surveys everywhere, cost 20% more at least than a project that would be given under a public-private partnership with a contract for a contractor, which is a fixed price, fixed time, and with high financial penalties. So, moving away from the traditional public procurement to more efficient ways, even using design and build contract, is a very difficult process when you have a very big administration and a strong union sort of driven administration that is afraid of going innovative. So the hope is, and I think it is positive, whoever is responsible for this is actually moving away from from this, and it's something that I think we will still see a lot of consequences of. I mean, this is not only the Second Avenue subway. I mean, the other thing is New York is also a special place for construction. And
so is the whole U.S., right? I mean, I think that I would sort of say there's U.S. is an active democracy, right? There's limits to eminent domain, there's public hearings, you can sue, you can lobby, all these things. Guess what? Most places in the world, the government does what they want. They want a subway, just go ahead and build it.
Right, but I think
away too quickly.
No. But burying a subway in New York City under Midtown Manhattan, it is complex, to say sort of the least. What I will say is I agree with everything you've said. In fact, if for one thing,
I can tell you more.
Well, but I mean, the biggest asset to reducing costs in New York City is design build, which New York City doesn't have the legal authority from the state to do. Design bid build.
But it's also, having a more open market for construction, for example. It's also having a more open market for design. It's also having a number of other things like that. So it's creating good construction price and efficiency in the construction industry goes through looking at the full chain from procurement to the service providers and how open it is and how competitive it is. And so that's something that we have to say. It's not efficient, for sure.
Thank you to all 4 of you. We'll break for lunch now. Everybody on stage will be here for another at least few minutes if you have any further questions for anybody. Box lunches will be available in the lobby, so you have that to look forward to. But after that, you also have Sherpa guided sessions to look forward to this afternoon. A reminder that there are 3 of them after lunch. One is Energy, Utilities 2.0. A second one is Climate, the state of the climate. And the last one is Society, Climate Action, and Leadership. And there will be signs at the front of all of the rooms for those so you know which one you're walking into. But for now, go forth and eat.
Thank you.